Imagine for a moment that the entire 4.5 billion year history of our planet is compressed into a single 24-hour day. On this cosmic clock, the oceans form in the early morning, and the giant dinosaurs don't even show up until nearly 11 p.m. And us? Modern humans? We only step out of the shadows and onto the stage in the very last few seconds before midnight. In those brief, frantic seconds, we have built sprawling megacities of glass and steel, split the atom, and connected the globe. We look around and assume we are the pinnacle of creation. But looking at the vast emptiness of the clock, it makes you wonder. In all the millions of years before our time started ticking, or even during those forgotten twilight hours of early human existence, were we really the first ones to build? How many mighty empires have risen, carved their arrogant names into solid rock, and then been swallowed whole by the mud, the crushing ice, and the relentless, unforgiving march of time? Are we simply the latest tenants living on top of a graveyard of forgotten worlds? Are there entire ancient civilizations lost beneath the ocean floor, leaving behind nothing but strange, out-of-place artifacts and whispered myths of catastrophic floods? Today, we are going to embark on a massive, globe-spanning journey to hunt down these lost ghosts. We will sift through the dust to unearth the shocking count of how many civilizations Earth has truly hosted, decoding ancient mysteries and peeling back the hidden layers of our planet's history. But before we dive deeper, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. Settle in, because the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. You can simply relax and let the story transport you across the ages. The ground beneath your feet is holding secrets. Let's dig them up. Before we can start pointing at maps and counting up the grand empires of the past, we have to pause and ask a seemingly simple question. What exactly is a civilization? It is a word we throw around a lot in modern conversation. We talk about civilized society, or the dawn of civilization, but the actual definition is remarkably blurry. It is a line drawn in the sand of history, and depending on which archaeologist or historian you ask, that line might move a few thousand years in either direction. To truly understand what we are looking for in the dirt, we need to strip away our modern biases. We need to forget about skyscrapers, Wi-Fi, jet engines, and stock markets. Those are just the shiny bells and whistles of our current era. To find the absolute bare-bones foundation of a civilization, we need to travel back in time and look at how early humans survived. Imagine a vast, untamed prehistoric landscape. Through the tall, whispering grass, a small tribe of perhaps 20 or 30 people is moving quietly. They are hunter-gatherers. They are brilliant, adaptable, and tough. They know every medicinal plant in the forest. They can track a wounded deer for miles, and they possess rich oral traditions, complex languages, and deep family bonds. They sit around the fire at night, looking up at the exact same stars we see today, telling stories to make sense of the dark. But are they a civilization? By the cold, clinical definition of historians, the answer is no. They are a culture. They are a society. But they lack an anchor, because they must follow the herds of mammoth or bison, and because they must move when the berries dry up or the winter winds howl. They are forever trapped in a state of survival motion. They live day to day, season to season. If a drought hits, they starve. If a storm washes away their temporary leather tents, they rebuild elsewhere. They leave nothing behind but footprints, the charred black ash of ancient campfires, and maybe a few scattered chipped stone arrowheads. A civilization cannot be built on the back of a moving mammoth. To cross the threshold from a wandering tribe into a true civilization, a group of humans needs 3 crucial ingredients, and the very first ingredient is the most important of all: agriculture. It sounds mundane, but the simple act of placing a seed into the mud and waiting for it to grow is the single most explosive revolution in human history. It was not an easy transition. Early farming was backbreaking, agonizing work. It meant calloused hands, digging in the dirt with sticks, and living in constant, terrifying anxiety, staring at the sky and praying for rain. But agriculture provided something magical that hunting never could: a surplus. A surplus means you have more food than you strictly need to survive today. You harvest the wheat, you dry it, you put it in a large clay pot, and you store it for the winter. This simple hoarding of calories changes the entire mathematics of human existence. This brings us to the second ingredient: the city. Once you have a barn full of precious grain, you cannot simply strap it to your back and walk away to chase a deer. You have to stay put to protect your treasure. You trade your temporary leather tent for a permanent structure made of heavy timber or baked mud bricks. Your neighbor builds a house next to yours. Then 50 other families join you, because there is safety and strength in numbers. Suddenly, a profound shift happens within the community. In a hunter-gatherer tribe, every single person must spend their waking hours looking for food. But in an agricultural village, because one farmer can grow enough food to feed 10 people, the other 9 people are suddenly free. They have free time. What do they do with this time? They specialize. One person realizes they are exceptionally good at molding clay, so they become a full-time potter, trading their bowls for the farmer's grain. Another person spends their days studying the movement of the sun and stars to predict the planting seasons, and they become a priest. Someone else picks up a sharp bronze spear, stands by the grain silo, and says, "I will protect our food from thieves," becoming the first soldier. You get blacksmiths, weavers, and kings. You get streets, walls, and bustling markets. You get the sensory overload of hundreds of people living shoulder to shoulder, the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, animal dung, and human ambition. You have birthed a city. But a city full of grain and specialized workers brings a new problem. It brings complexity. Imagine you are the manager of the central grain silo. Hundreds of farmers are dropping off baskets of barley to pay their taxes. How do you remember that a man named Bob dropped off 4 baskets, but a woman named Alice only brought 2? Human memory is incredibly flawed. You cannot keep the economy of a whole city in your head. You need a receipt. You need the third and final ingredient of civilization: writing and record-keeping. The invention of writing did not start with beautiful poetry, grand romantic plays, or deep philosophical treatises. It started with stressed-out accountants and tax collectors trying to keep track of beer, livestock, and grain. An ancient official took a sharpened reed, pressed it into a slab of wet clay from the riverbank, and made a few simple scratches. 1 scratch for 1 basket of wheat, a symbol for a cow, a symbol for a name. When that clay baked hard in the hot sun, they created something miraculous. They created the first hard drive. They created permanent data. Writing is the ultimate cheat code for humanity. It allows knowledge, laws, and debts to survive long past the death of the person who thought of them. It allows a society to reach out across the centuries and speak directly to us. So, there is our checklist. If an ancient group of people mastered agriculture to create a surplus, settled down to build urban cities, and invented a system of writing or record-keeping, they officially earn the title of civilization. If the rules are that simple, why is counting them so incredibly difficult? Why can't we just point to a map of the world, tally them up, 1, 2, 50, 100, and give you an exact number right now? Because trying to count human civilizations is exactly like trying to count the grains of sand on a stormy, wind-swept beach. Imagine a group of children playing on that beach, building intricate sand castles. One child builds a massive, sprawling fortress with high walls. That is the Roman Empire. Another child, far down the beach, builds a tall, slender, mysterious tower. That is the Maya. Another builds a perfectly square, heavy block. That is ancient Egypt. But the tide is always coming in. In human history, the tide takes the form of relentless time, brutal wars, devastating famines, and sudden shifts in the global climate. The dark water washes over the beach. Sometimes the wave is absolutely catastrophic. A sandcastle is completely flattened, dissolved back into the mud, wiped from existence so thoroughly that we don't even know it was ever there. The people scatter, the language is forgotten, and the jungle grows over the stones. But other times, the wave only destroys half the castle. The walls crumble, but the foundation remains. And later, new people come along. They find the ruined foundation, and they build a brand new tower right on top of the old one, using different sand and a different design. This happens constantly in history. When an empire falls, the people rarely just vanish into thin air. They adapt. They merge with their conquerors. They change their gods. They change their clothes. And they start speaking a new language. When the ancient Egyptians finally stopped carving hieroglyphs and started speaking Greek under the rule of the Ptolemies, did the Egyptian civilization die? Or did it just get a new coat of paint? Where does one civilization end and another one begin? The borders in time are hopelessly blurred. Furthermore, the deeper we dig into the dirt, the darker and murkier the picture becomes. We are trying to piece together a massive million-piece jigsaw puzzle, but we only have about 10 pieces, and we don't have the picture on the box. Every time a farmer plows a field and uncovers a strange piece of pottery, or every time a satellite detects a weird, unnatural square shape hidden deep beneath the Amazon rainforest, the entire timeline has to be rewritten. We are not just counting. We are actively hunting for ghosts in the dark. So, let's begin our hunt. Let's travel back to a time before human hands ever touched a stone, to see if the earth was truly empty before we arrived. To truly grasp the elusive nature of our search, we have to step completely out of the human story. We have to leave behind the familiar territory of the last 10,000 years, the clay tablets, the buried stone walls, the ancient campfires, and look into the terrifying, dizzying abyss of deep time. The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Complex life, the kind that crawls out of the ocean and walks on dry land, has been around for about 400 million years. Dinosaurs ruled this globe for an astonishing 165 million years. To put that into perspective, the fearsome Tyrannosaurus rex lived closer in time to us sitting here today than it did to the Stegosaurus. That is how vast the prehistoric timeline is. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been walking around with our big, clever brains for perhaps 300,000 years. We have only been building cities for roughly 10,000 of those years. Our entire history of civilization is a mathematical rounding error in the grand biography of the planet. This vast, empty ocean of time leads to a haunting question. It is a question that sounds like pure science fiction, but it is actually a serious thought experiment debated by modern astrophysicists and geologists. What if we are not the first? What if, tens of millions of years ago, long before the first ape-like creature ever thought to pick up a stick on the African savanna, another species achieved high intelligence? What if there was a prehistoric, non-human civilization that built sprawling cities, navigated the oceans, and mastered the atom? In 2018, two brilliant scientists, Adam Frank, an astrophysicist, and Gavin Schmidt, the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, published a fascinating paper exploring this exact concept. They called it the Silurian hypothesis. The name is a playful nod to a classic episode of the British science fiction show Doctor Who, which featured an ancient race of advanced subterranean reptiles called the Silurians. But while the name was a pop culture reference, the science behind the paper was deadly serious. Frank and Schmidt were not trying to prove that intelligent dinosaurs actually existed and drove sports cars. Instead, they were asking a profound question about the limits of human knowledge. If an industrial civilization did exist on Earth 50 or 100 million years ago, would we even be able to find a single trace of it today? To understand their answer, we have to engage in a radical thought experiment. Close your eyes and travel back in time to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a period roughly 55 million years ago. The Earth is drastically different. It is a hothouse world. There is no ice at the poles. Instead, lush, swampy rainforests stretch all the way to Antarctica. The oceans are incredibly warm, and the continents are arranged in unfamiliar shapes. Now, imagine that in this steaming, vibrant world, a specific species of early mammal, or perhaps a surviving lineage of highly evolved bipedal reptiles, develops a sudden leap in consciousness. They have grasping hands. They have complex vocal cords for communication. They possess a deep, insatiable curiosity. Slowly, over tens of thousands of years, they follow the same inevitable path we did. They figure out how to harness fire. They transition from hunting to organized agriculture, domesticating the bizarre flora and fauna of their era. They build small villages of timber and mud, which eventually grow into massive, sprawling metropolitan centers. Imagine their cities. Perhaps their architecture is fundamentally different from ours, built to accommodate tails or different sensory organs. But the basic physics of a city remain the same. They need roads. They need bridges crossing mighty prehistoric rivers. They need sanitation systems. Eventually, they experience their own industrial revolution. They discover the vast reserves of ancient compressed carbon buried beneath their feet, coal and oil laid down hundreds of millions of years before their time. They build factories that belch smoke into the Paleocene sky. They create global shipping networks, synthetic fertilizers to feed their billions, and perhaps even launch crude satellites into orbit to stare down at their bustling, illuminated globe. They reign supreme for 100,000 years, 10 times longer than human civilization has existed. And then, for whatever reason, a devastating global war, a catastrophic engineered pandemic, or an apocalyptic asteroid strike. They fall, their civilization collapses, and their species goes completely extinct. The last of their kind dies out, leaving behind a silent planet covered in concrete, steel, glass, and plastic. If this happened 55 million years ago, surely we would trip over their ruins today, right? Surely a farmer plowing a field in modern-day Kansas would accidentally dig up a fossilized spark plug, or a coal miner in Wales would find the crushing remains of a prehistoric laptop? The terrifying, absolute answer is no. We would find absolutely nothing. To understand why, you have to understand that the Earth is not a passive museum shelf that carefully preserves everything placed upon it. The Earth is a violent, churning, relentless recycling machine. It is the ultimate eraser. Let's look at what would happen to our own proud, modern civilization if humanity were to vanish suddenly tomorrow. Within the first year, nature begins her swift reclamation. Weeds violently push their way through the asphalt of every highway on Earth. Without constant maintenance and pumping, the subway systems of New York, London, and Tokyo flood with groundwater in a matter of days, turning into dark, subterranean rivers. Within 100 years, the structural integrity of our world begins to fail. The massive steel support cables of suspension bridges, like the Golden Gate, succumb to relentless corrosion from salty air and rain. They snap, sending thousands of tons of concrete plunging into the dark water below. The glass facades of towering skyscrapers, battered by decades of unmitigated storms and thermal expansion, shatter and rain down onto the overgrown streets. Within 1,000 years, almost every building made of wood, brick, or modern Portland cement has completely collapsed. The ruins are swallowed whole by dense, expanding forests or buried beneath creeping desert dunes. But 1,000 years is nothing in geologic time. Let us jump forward 1,000,000 years. In 1,000,000 years, the glass is completely dissolved back into the sand it came from. The steel has completely oxidized, turning into nothing more than thin, reddish streaks of iron ore in the soil. Even the plastics, the indestructible scourge of our modern oceans, are eventually broken down by the relentless pounding of UV radiation, microscopic bacteria, and the slow, grinding friction of the environment, reverting back into basic hydrocarbon molecules. And then comes the final, most devastating blow: plate tectonics. The crust of the Earth is not a solid, unbroken shell. It is a cracked puzzle of massive, drifting tectonic plates floating on a sea of superheated, semi-liquid magma. These plates are constantly moving, crashing into each other, and sliding beneath one another. Imagine a baker kneading a massive ball of dough. The dough on the surface gets pushed down deep into the center, while the dough from the center is pushed up to the top. The Earth does the exact same thing with its own surface, just on a timescale of millions of years. Where the tectonic plates meet, one plate is often forced deep down into the Earth's fiery mantle in a process called subduction. Any ancient city, any rusted metal bridge, any layer of fossilized plastic that happens to be sitting on that section of crust is dragged down into the subterranean inferno. It is crushed under millions of tons of pressure and completely melted back into raw, unrecognizable magma. It is recycled. Simultaneously, the land that remains on the surface is constantly being sandblasted by the weather. Rain is naturally slightly acidic. Over tens of millions of years, rain can dissolve entire mountain ranges, washing the rock down into the sea as fine silt. Mile-thick glaciers advance and retreat, acting like colossal sheets of sandpaper, grinding the surface of the continents down to the bedrock and pushing everything in their path into the ocean. Because of this relentless churning and grinding, the surface of the Earth is surprisingly young. In fact, most of the surface of our planet is less than a few million years old. If you want to find rock that is 50 million years old, you generally have to dig incredibly deep, and even then, you only have access to a tiny, fractured fraction of what the surface used to look like. The vast majority of the crust that existed 50 million years ago has either been pulverized into dust and scattered across the ocean floor, or it has been dragged into the mantle and melted. So, if our hypothetical dinosaur civilization built a sprawling metropolis 55 million years ago, the crushing forces of time, weather, and plate tectonics would have ground every single brick, every single pipe, and every single bone into molecular dust. They would be completely erased from the physical record. This realization is profoundly humbling. It means that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. We cannot confidently look at the empty dirt and say, "We are the first." However, the scientists behind the Silurian hypothesis point out one chilling caveat. While we might never find a prehistoric skyscraper or a fossilized microchip, an advanced industrial civilization would leave a different kind of ghost behind. They would leave a chemical signature. If a civilization burns billions of tons of ancient fossil fuels to power their cities, just like we do, they alter the chemical composition of the entire atmosphere. This massive influx of carbon creates a distinct, unnatural spike in carbon isotopes that gets trapped in the deep ocean sediment and the microscopic shells of ancient plankton. Furthermore, an industrial society would likely spread synthetic chemicals, unusual concentrations of heavy metals, and perhaps the radioactive fallout from nuclear fission across the globe, leaving a razor-thin, anomalous chemical layer trapped in the geologic strata. Fascinatingly, when geologists look at the rock layers from exactly 55 million years ago, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, they do see a massive, inexplicable spike in carbon isotopes. They see evidence that the global temperature skyrocketed incredibly fast, oceans became highly acidic, and there was a sudden, massive extinction of life. Mainstream science attributes this terrifying ancient climate change to massive natural volcanic eruptions burning through vast underground coal deposits. It is the most logical, natural explanation. But in the quiet, speculative corners of astrophysics, the Silurian hypothesis lingers like a phantom. We will likely never know if another intelligence looked up at the stars before we did. The Earth is a master at keeping secrets, diligently sweeping away the ashes of the past to make room for the new. But the mere possibility that an entire global civilization could vanish without a physical trace is a stark reminder. It forces us to look at our own sprawling, concrete world not as a permanent triumph, but as a fragile, temporary arrangement on a very restless planet. Let us leave behind the dizzying millions of years of deep time and pull the camera much closer to our own era. We are winding the cosmic clock forward to a time that feels almost within our grasp, yet remains cloaked in thick, freezing fog. The time is roughly 12,000 years ago. Welcome to the end of the last ice age. If you were to stand in what is now modern-day New York or Chicago during this period, you would not see grassy plains or forests. You would be standing at the foot of a towering mile-high wall of solid blue-white ice. The Laurentide ice sheet suffocated much of the northern hemisphere. Because so much of the Earth's water was locked up in these colossal frozen glaciers, the global sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. The coastlines of our continents looked completely different. England was connected to Europe by a massive, fertile land bridge. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska without getting your feet wet. Mainstream archaeology paints a very specific picture of humanity during this freezing epoch. We are told that our ancestors were purely nomadic hunter-gatherers, huddled in dark caves, wearing thick animal skins, and slowly, painstakingly hunting woolly mammoths with primitive spears. But what if that picture is dangerously incomplete? There is a powerful, controversial theory that challenges everything we think we know about this period. It is an idea that has captured the modern imagination, moving from the fringes of alternative history into mainstream conversation. It proposes that while some humans were indeed hunting mammoths in the snow, another group of humans had already figured it out. The theory suggests that 12,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, a highly advanced, global maritime civilization already existed. We are not talking about science fiction aliens or people flying around in spaceships. We are talking about brilliant, sophisticated humans who had mastered the oceans. Imagine a civilization of master navigators, sailing ships made of heavy timber, using advanced mathematics to map the complex movements of the stars. Imagine coastal megacities built from massive, perfectly cut polygonal stones, situated on those ancient lower coastlines that are now completely submerged beneath hundreds of feet of dark ocean water. According to this alternative history, these people were the ultimate explorers. They possessed a deep understanding of agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. They were a Golden Age society, thriving in the warmer equatorial pockets of the Ice Age world. So, if they existed, where did they go? Why is there no empire left? The answer lies in the sky, and in an event so catastrophic it shattered the world. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth experienced a sudden, violent, and inexplicable climate shock known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures, which had been gradually warming, suddenly plunged back into a brutal, deep freeze, only to violently snap back to rapid warming 1,000 years later. Those who believe in a lost Ice Age civilization point to a terrifying trigger for this chaos: a comet. Imagine a massive, fragmented comet, hiding in the blinding glare of the sun, hurtling toward Earth. It does not strike the solid ground to leave a neat, round crater. Instead, these blazing fragments slam directly into the mile-thick North American ice cap. The kinetic energy released is incomprehensible, thousands of times more powerful than the global nuclear arsenal. The flash of light sears the retinas of anyone looking at the northern sky. The impact instantly vaporizes millions of tons of ice, throwing a blinding blanket of steam, ash, and pulverized rock into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun for years. But the real nightmare is the water. The sudden, localized melting of the ice cap liberates billions of gallons of freezing fresh water in a matter of hours. This water does not just politely flow into the ocean. It surges across the continent in roaring, catastrophic megafloods, miles high and carrying boulders the size of houses, violently scouring the landscape down to the bedrock. When this unimaginable volume of water finally hits the oceans, global sea levels rapidly surge upward. The rising water violently swallows the ancient coastlines. Those magnificent, hypothetical maritime cities, the ports, the temples, the centers of learning, are drowned in a matter of weeks, plunging into the crushing, lightless depths of the sea. The survivors of this golden empire, scattered and traumatized, wash up on the shores of primitive hunter-gatherer lands. They arrive in boats, wearing strange clothes, possessing magical-seeming knowledge of agriculture and stonemasonry. They teach the terrified locals how to rebuild. And in return, the locals remember them as gods who came from the sea. Is this just an incredibly cinematic story? Perhaps, but it draws its power from one of the most baffling mysteries of human history, the universal flood myth. No matter where you go on this planet, you will find a story about the world ending in a great deluge. The Christian and Hebrew Bible tells the story of Noah, building an ark to survive God's watery wrath. Thousands of years before Noah, the ancient Sumerians wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, detailing a man named Utnapishtim, who built a giant boat to survive a divinely ordered flood. The ancient Maya in Central America had legends of a great rain of fire and water that destroyed the previous world. Deep in the mountains of India, ancient Hindu texts describe a king named Manu, who is warned by a sacred fish about an incoming world-drowning wave. Why? Why do cultures separated by impassable oceans and thousands of years of history all share the exact same nightmare? Is it simply a coincidence that early cities were built near rivers that sometimes flooded? Or is the universal flood myth actually a fragmented, traumatized genetic memory of the younger Dryas megafloods? Are these ancient texts desperately trying to whisper a warning to us about the day the ocean swallowed the first civilization? This brings us to the ultimate ghost story, the most famous lost civilization of all time, Atlantis. When people hear the word Atlantis, they picture mermaids, magical crystals, and underwater domes. But to find the origin of Atlantis, we have to strip away the Hollywood fantasy and travel to ancient Athens, Greece, around the year 360 BC. An old, brilliant philosopher named Plato sits down and writes two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In these texts, he describes an incredibly powerful, wealthy empire located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out in the Atlantic Ocean. Plato does not describe magic. He describes a highly organized Bronze Age superpower. He describes an island featuring a capital city built of perfect concentric rings of alternating land and water, connected by massive bridges. He describes bustling docks smelling of pitch and sea salt, a mighty navy of trireme warships, and temples gleaming with gold, silver, and a mysterious, fiery metal called orichalcum. But, Plato writes, the Atlanteans became arrogant and corrupt. In a single terrifying day and night of violent earthquakes and floods, The entire island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, vanishing forever into the mud. For over 2,000 years, explorers have desperately searched the ocean floor for Plato's concentric rings. They have looked in the Caribbean, off the coast of Africa, and even under the ice of Antarctica. They have found nothing. Because to solve the mystery of Atlantis, and to understand the truth behind the Ice Age conspiracies, we have to look at how history is actually recorded by human beings. We are a species of storytellers. We exaggerate. We turn local tragedies into global myths. Mainstream science provides a sobering but equally terrifying explanation for both the flood and Atlantis. The end of the Ice Age did indeed cause massive flooding. As the world naturally warmed over thousands of years, the ice melted, and the seas relentlessly crept higher, drowning millions of square miles of prime coastal real estate. Entire land masses like Doggerland, a massive, fertile plain that once connected Britain to Europe, were slowly, agonizingly swallowed by the rising tide, forcing thousands of prehistoric tribes to pack up and flee inland. This slow-motion apocalypse was deeply traumatic. It was passed down from grandparents to grandchildren over thousands of campfires, slowly evolving from a regional climate shift into a sudden, divine punishment. And what about Atlantis? Did Plato completely invent it? Historians believe Plato was likely borrowing from a very real, very horrific historical event, but he shifted the timeline and the location to make a philosophical point. The true face of Atlantis is likely not found in the deep Atlantic, but in the sun-drenched Mediterranean Sea. Long before Plato was born, a brilliant civilization thrived on the island of Crete and the surrounding Aegean islands. We call them the Minoans. They were wealthy, peaceful, and vibrant. They built magnificent multi-story palaces with indoor plumbing. They painted beautiful, colorful frescoes of dolphins and young men leaping over the backs of charging bulls. They were the undisputed masters of Mediterranean trade. But just 70 miles north of Crete sat the island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Thera was a bustling Minoan port city, built into the slopes of a towering mountain. What the Minoans did not know was that the mountain was a sleeping monster. Around 1600 BC, Thera woke up. It was one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. The explosion literally ripped the island apart, blowing the center of the landmass entirely into the stratosphere. A colossal, boiling cloud of ash and pumice blackened the sky, turning day into night across the entire Mediterranean. The collapse of the volcano into the sea displaced millions of tons of water, generating a series of towering, unstoppable tsunamis. These massive walls of water slammed into the coastlines of Crete and the surrounding islands, obliterating the Minoan fleets, smashing their beautiful coastal cities into kindling and salting their agricultural fields, destroying their ability to grow food. In a single day and night of fire and water, the heart of the Minoan maritime empire was violently erased. Traders from Egypt and the Middle East, sailing to the Aegean months later to do business, would have found nothing but floating pumice stone and ruined, silent shores. The island they traded with had literally sunk into the sea. This terrifying news spread across the ancient world. Over centuries, the story of the island that sank beneath the waves was told and retold, heavily embellished with each generation, until it eventually reached the ears of Plato, who transformed the tragedy of Thera into the moral fable of Atlantis. We do not need a comet striking an ice sheet to explain the disappearance of ancient worlds. We do not need an advanced, global civilization of Ice Age mariners to explain the heavy, sunken stones off our coasts. The truth is profound enough. The truth is that the Earth is incredibly volatile. A shifting ocean current, a melting glacier, or a restless mountain of magma is more than capable of resetting the clock on human ambition, turning thriving, arrogant empires into nothing more than ghost stories whispered around a fire. As we move forward on our journey, leaving the ice and the myth behind, we will begin to look at the civilizations that did leave undeniable proof in the dirt. We will travel to the baking deserts of the Middle East to see what happens when humanity finally decides to stop running and starts building. Let us step out of the freezing mythological fog of the Ice Age and into the blistering, unforgiving heat of reality. We are leaving behind the ghosts and the sunken continents to look at the undeniable, physical proof of human ambition. We are traveling to a place where the dirt itself was transformed into the first true engines of human history. Welcome to the cradle of civilization. Welcome to the ancient Middle East and the sprawling plains of Asia. Imagine it is roughly the year 3200 BC. You are standing in the lower Mesopotamian plain in what is now modern-day southern Iraq. The sun here is absolute and punishing. It beats down on a flat, seemingly endless landscape of cracked brown earth. But cutting through this arid wasteland are two massive, slow-moving ribbons of life: the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Here, nestled between these two rivers, sits the mighty city of Uruk. It is the beating heart of the Sumerian civilization. To understand Uruk, you have to forget everything you know about modern cities. There is no steel, there is no glass, there is not even any stone. The entire city, home to perhaps 40 or 50,000 souls, is built entirely out of baked river mud. It is a sprawling, chaotic maze of tightly packed mud brick houses, narrow, winding alleyways, and massive defensive walls. Let us zoom in and follow a single inhabitant of this city as they wake up. Our ancient Sumerian does not sleep inside their house. In the suffocating heat of the Mesopotamian summer, the interior of a mud brick home is an oven. Instead, they wake up on the flat roof of their dwelling, lying on a woven mat made of river reeds. As the sun peeks over the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, the city is already roaring to life. The air is thick with a complex, overwhelming mixture of scents. You can smell the sharp tang of wood smoke from thousands of cooking fires, the earthy smell of livestock penned in small courtyards, the pungent odor of human waste in the streets, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of baking bread. Our Sumerian climbs down a crude wooden ladder to the courtyard below to have breakfast. And what is the breakfast of champions in the ancient world? It is beer. But this is not the crisp, cold, highly filtered lager you buy in a glass bottle today. Sumerian beer is a thick, cloudy, porridge-like concoction made from fermented barley. It is highly nutritious, packed with calories, and most importantly, it is safer to drink than the water from the river, which is teeming with bacteria. Because the ancient beer is full of floating grain husks and debris, our Sumerian does not drink it from a cup. They drink it from a large communal clay jar using a long, hollow reed as a straw, plunging the reed deep beneath the floating layer of scum to get to the intoxicating liquid below. After finishing his liquid breakfast, our citizen steps out into the bustling, noisy street. He is a man of immense importance, though he carries no sword and wears no crown. He is a scribe. He is an accountant. He walks toward the center of the city, where the skyline is dominated by a colossal terraced step pyramid called a ziggurat. This artificial mountain of mud brick, towering over the flat plains, is the temple of the city's patron god. But the temple is not just a place of worship. It is the central bank, the grain silo, and the administrative headquarters of the entire city-state. Our scribe enters a shaded, open-air courtyard within the temple complex. It is loud. Farmers are arguing with priests. Shepherds are dragging bleating sheep to be counted. The air smells of sweat, wet clay, and roasting mutton from the sacrificial altars. He sits cross-legged on a woven mat. Next to him is a large pile of wet, high-quality clay brought up from the riverbank, and a small pile of thin, sharpened reeds. A foreman approaches him, shouting over the noise, reporting the daily distribution of rations to the temple workers. Our scribe takes a handful of the wet, sticky clay and rolls it into a small, smooth, rectangular pillow that fits perfectly in the palm of his hand. Then he takes his sharpened reed, the stylus. He does not drag the reed across the clay to draw pictures. Instead, he presses the wedge-shaped tip of the reed directly into the soft mud, leaving a distinct triangular impression. Press, lift, turn, press. He is writing in cuneiform, the world's first system of writing. This is the exact moment humanity crosses the invisible line from prehistory into history. And what profound, earth-shattering poetry is he recording for the ages? What divine secrets of the cosmos is he etching into the mud? He is writing a grocery receipt. He makes a few wedge marks that represent the number 20. He makes a symbol that represents jars of beer. And he makes another symbol that represents workers. He sets the clay tablet down in the baking sun to dry. In a few hours, that soft mud will turn into a rock-hard hard drive. This is how civilization actually functions. It is not built on philosophy. It is built on logistics. The Sumerians invented writing not to express their souls, but to make sure nobody was stealing the beer. With this simple act of pressing a stick into mud, the Sumerians invented bureaucracy, taxation, and the concept of permanent data. They built the foundation of the modern world out of dirt. But while the Sumerians were busy writing receipts in the chaotic, noisy, and frankly, filthy streets of Uruk, another civilization was rising much further to the east. And they were doing something completely different. Something that defies logic. Let us leave the scorching deserts of Iraq and travel roughly 1,500 miles to the east to the lush, fertile basin of the Indus River in what is today modern Pakistan and northwestern India. The year is now 2500 BC. We are approaching a city called Mohenjo-Daro, the crown jewel of the Harappan, or Indus Valley, civilization. As you walk toward this ancient metropolis, the very first thing you notice is what is missing. In Egypt, the skyline is dominated by megalomaniacal pyramids built for god-kings. In Sumer, massive ziggurats crush the landscape. But as you look at Mohenjo-Daro, you do not see any towering palaces. You do not see grand, terrifying statues of warlords holding the severed heads of their enemies. You do not see any obvious temples. Instead, you see an absolute masterpiece of obsessive, mathematical urban planning. Mohenjo-Daro is laid out on a perfect, rigid grid system, exactly like modern-day Manhattan. The main boulevards are perfectly straight, intersecting exactly at right angles. The streets are carefully paved with baked bricks, and the bricks themselves are a bizarre mystery. If you pick up a brick in Mohenjo-Daro and then travel 500 miles north to another Indus city called Harappa, and pick up a brick there, they will be exactly the same. The Indus Valley people manufactured millions upon millions of bricks across a massive empire, and every single one of them was made to an exact standardized ratio of 4 to 2 to 1, length to width to thickness. This level of extreme, standardized mass production implies an incredibly powerful, centralized authority. Yet archaeologists have never found a single royal tomb, a single palace, or a single piece of propaganda art praising a ruler. But the true shock of Mohenjo-Daro is not its bricks or its grid. It is what lies beneath the streets. Let us walk into a typical middle-class home in this ancient city. The house is large, built around a central open-air courtyard to let in the light and air. The walls are thick, providing insulation from the intense summer heat. You walk up a solid brick staircase to the second floor. Here, you find something that will not be seen again in human history until the 19th century in London or Paris. You find a dedicated bathroom. Our ancient Indus Valley citizen steps into a small room with a perfectly paved, sloped brick floor. They take a bath by pouring jugs of water over themselves. But the water does not just pool on the floor or spill out into the street. The sloped floor directs the wastewater into a small drain cut into the wall. This drain connects to a vertical terracotta pipe built inside the brickwork of the house. The water rushes down the pipe, out of the house, and directly into a covered, brick-lined sewer system that runs beneath the main streets of the city. Yes, this ancient civilization, living 4,500 years ago, had flushing toilets and an underground municipal sewer system. If you walk down the perfectly straight street, you will notice large stones covering specific holes in the pavement. These are manhole covers. Ancient sanitation workers, city employees, would routinely lift these covers to climb down into the deep, brick-lined trenches to clear out blockages and maintain the flow of waste away from the drinking water supply. Every single house in the city, from the largest estates to the smallest dwellings, was connected to this massive unified plumbing network. Furthermore, the city was dotted with hundreds of meticulously constructed public wells, providing clean, fresh drinking water to every neighborhood. At the center of the city sits their most impressive structure, an area archaeologists call the Great Bath. It is a massive, rectangular brick pool accessed by wide staircases. To ensure the pool held water without leaking into the surrounding soil, the Indus engineers coated the bricks with a thick layer of natural tar, or bitumen. It was a perfectly waterproofed ancient swimming pool, likely used for ritual purification. The Indus Valley civilization is perhaps the most tantalizing ghost in all of human history. They built the cleanest, most egalitarian, and most perfectly planned cities the ancient world had ever seen. They traded heavily with the Sumerians. We know this because we have found Indus Valley seals deep inside Mesopotamian ruins. Yet, they are a silent empire. We have found thousands of their artifacts, beautiful, intricately carved soapstone seals depicting elephants, tigers, and unicorns. Above the animals, there are lines of strange, elegant symbols, It is their writing system. But unlike the Sumerian cuneiform or the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Indus Valley script has never been deciphered. Despite a century of trying and the use of modern supercomputers, we cannot read a single word they wrote. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their myths, their songs, or their laws. And then, just as mysteriously as they built their perfect, clean cities, they vanished. Around 1900 BC, the sprawling grid cities were slowly abandoned, the great sewers choked with debris. The standardized brick factories shut down. Why? They were not conquered. Archaeologists have found almost no weapons of war in the Indus Valley, no swords, no shields, no chariots. It appears they lived in unprecedented, continent-spanning peace. Their killer was not an invading army, but the environment itself. The mighty Sarasvati River, a major lifeline of their agricultural system, dried up due to tectonic shifts. The monsoon rain patterns changed, bringing devastating decades-long droughts. The mathematical perfection of their cities could not save them from the brutal reality of a shifting climate. They packed up their belongings, left their beautiful bathrooms behind, and dispersed into smaller rural farming villages, their great civilization slowly fading into the dust. We have seen the mud and the bureaucracy of Sumer, and we have marveled at the clean, silent geometry of the Indus Valley. But our journey is far from over. It is time to travel to a place where the dirt was not just formed into bricks, but carved into mountains of solid rock. It is time to look at the civilizations that obsessed over eternity, and the bizarre theories we have invented to explain their impossible achievements. We have established a very clear, logical rule for how human history is supposed to work. Remember our checklist from the beginning of this journey. First, humans figure out how to farm. Then, because they have a surplus of food, they settle down and build cities. Finally, with the free time provided by city life, they invent writing, complex art, and massive, organized religion. Agriculture births the city, and the city births the temple. It is a neat, tidy, and perfectly logical progression. It was the unquestioned bedrock of modern archaeology for over a century, until we dug up a dusty, sun-baked hill in southeastern Turkey and realized we had the entire story completely backward. Let us leave the mud brick cities of the river valleys and travel up into the golden, rolling hills of the Anatolian plains. The place is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates from Turkish as Potbelly Hill. For generations, local shepherds walked over this gentle, rounded mound, occasionally noticing strange, rectangular pieces of limestone poking out of the dry dirt. Most assumed it was just an abandoned medieval cemetery. But in the mid-1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started to dig. What he found beneath the soil did not just rewrite the history books. It took the history books, tore them to shreds, and scattered them to the wind. Beneath the dirt, Schmidt uncovered a massive, sprawling complex of circular stone enclosures. Planted firmly at the center of these circles were towering, monolithic pillars carved out of solid limestone. They were shaped like giant capital T's, and they were massive. The largest pillars stand over 16 feet tall and weigh upwards of 20 tons. But it wasn't just the size that was shocking. It was the artwork. These heavy pillars were not rough, unhewn blocks. They were masterfully carved, with highly stylized, terrifying, low-relief sculptures of wild animals. There are massive scorpions, lunging foxes, snarling boars, lions, spiders, and vultures playing with human heads. It is an awe-inspiring, haunting, and undeniably sophisticated architectural masterpiece. Then, scientists took organic material found at the site, bits of charcoal from ancient fires and bone fragments, and tested them using radiocarbon dating to see exactly when this magnificent temple was built. When the results came back, the scientific community collectively gasped. Göbekli Tepe was constructed roughly 11,600 years ago. To put that incomprehensible number into perspective, let us look at the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid is incredibly ancient. It was built roughly 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge in England was built about 5,000 years ago. This means that to the people who built Stonehenge and the pyramids, Göbekli Tepe was already impossibly ancient history. Göbekli Tepe is older to the ancient Egyptians than the ancient Egyptians are to us sitting here today. It sits right at the bitter end of the last ice age. And here is the paradigm-shattering problem. 11,600 years ago, nobody on Earth knew how to farm. There was no pottery, there was no wheel, there were no domesticated beasts of burden like horses or oxen. Metal tools like bronze and iron were thousands of years away from being invented. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were pure nomadic hunter-gatherers. They wore animal skins and chased wild gazelles with flint-tipped spears. This impossible contradiction immediately gave birth to a tidal wave of conspiracy theories. When you look at a perfectly carved 20-ton limestone pillar, and you are told that cavemen built it using nothing but sharpened rocks, your brain naturally rebels. The alternative history community, the proponents of ancient aliens, and the believers in a lost Ice Age civilization of Atlantis seized upon Göbekli Tepe as their ultimate smoking gun. The conspiracy theory goes like this. It is physically impossible for disorganized, primitive hunter-gatherers to carve and transport 20-ton megaliths. They simply did not have the engineering knowledge, the caloric energy, or the tools. Therefore, someone must have taught them. Perhaps it was a surviving group of highly advanced mariners fleeing the catastrophic floods of the Younger Dryas, bringing the secrets of high masonry and geometry to the primitive locals. Or perhaps it was extraterrestrial visitors using anti-gravity beams and laser cutters to effortlessly slice the limestone, leaving the terrifying animal carvings as a cosmic warning. It is a seductive, thrilling narrative. But the truth uncovered by rigorous archaeological science is actually far more fascinating, and it proves that human beings are far more capable than we give them credit for. Let us break down the impossible engineering using basic physics and the reality of the Stone Age. First, how did they cut the stone without lasers or steel? The answer lies in the geology of the region. The limestone plateau surrounding Göbekli Tepe is relatively soft when it is first exposed to the air. You do not need steel to carve it. You just need a rock that is harder than limestone. The builders used abundant local flint and obsidian, volcanic glass that can hold an edge sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. It is not magic. It is simply an agonizing, staggering amount of elbow grease. Dozens of men, sitting in the baking sun for weeks, rhythmically chipping away at the bedrock, using water and sand to smooth the edges. Second, how did they move a 20-ton pillar without wheels or aliens? You do not need a diesel crane if you have the most powerful force in the ancient world. human cooperation. Imagine the scene. A 20-ton pillar is finally separated from the bedrock quarry a few hundred yards away from the building site. To move it, they construct a simple but effective system of wooden rollers made from thick tree trunks stripped of their bark. They weave incredibly thick, strong ropes out of wild plant fibers and animal sinew. Then, they gather the muscle. It would take roughly 50 to 100 strong individuals pulling in perfect, rhythmic synchronization to slowly inch that monstrous stone forward. Heave! Heave! But how do you get hundreds of nomadic, independent hunter-gatherers who normally travel in small family bands of 20 people to suddenly drop their hunting spears and work together on a grueling, back-breaking construction project for months on end? You throw the greatest party the world has ever seen. Archaeologists excavating the site found something incredible in the refuse pits surrounding the monumental pillars. They found the butchered bones of tens of thousands of wild animals, gazelles, aurochs, giant wild cattle, boars, and massive flocks of birds. They also found huge stone vats capable of holding nearly 40 gallons of liquid, which chemical analysis suggests were used to brew a primitive, weak, but intoxicating wild grass beer. The science suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not built by a slave labor force commanded by a king, nor was it built by aliens. It was built through a system of massive, festive feasts. Different nomadic tribes from hundreds of miles around would gather at this sacred hill at specific times of the year. They would hunt massive herds of migrating animals, roast tons of meat over open fires, brew vast quantities of beer, and in exchange for this epic, calorie-rich festival, the attendees would provide the sheer muscle power needed to drag the stones. It was a religious pilgrimage, a massive communal barbecue, and a monumental construction project all rolled into one. And this brings us to the ultimate scientific revelation of Göbekli Tepe, the realization that completely flipped our understanding of human civilization. Remember the old rule: agriculture comes first, which allows people to settle down, which leads to the invention of religion. Göbekli Tepe proves that the exact opposite is true. Imagine you are the spiritual leader or the organizer of these massive temple-building festivals. Year after year, the temples get bigger, the crowds get larger. You're now trying to feed thousands of exhausted stone haulers. Suddenly, hunting wild gazelle is not enough. Gathering scattered wild wheat from the hillsides is too slow. The demand for calories to fuel the temple construction is outpacing what wild nature can freely provide. You need a reliable, massive, and localized source of food. You need a surplus. Just 20 miles away from Göbekli Tepe is the Cahokia mountain range. Modern geneticists have traced the DNA of almost all modern domesticated wheat, the wheat in your bread, your pasta, and your cereal, back to a single, wild strain of einkorn wheat that grows naturally on the slopes of that exact mountain. The science points to a breathtaking conclusion. Humans did not invent agriculture because they were tired of hunting. They invented agriculture because they needed to feed the massive workforce building their temples. The desire to worship, to gather, to tell stories, and to carve monstrous animals into towering stones came first. Religion did not follow civilization. Religion created civilization. The temple birthed the city. The people of Göbekli Tepe literally willed agriculture into existence so they could stay in one place and gaze up at their stone gods. They bent the natural world to their spiritual will, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the human species forever. Once the secret of domesticating wheat was unlocked, the need for a nomadic lifestyle vanished. The wild, sprawling festivals slowly transitioned into permanent settlements. The era of the hunter-gatherer began its long, slow decline, and the grand, messy, and violent age of empires officially began. But as we leave the dizzying heights of the Turkish plateaus and prepare to cross the oceans, we will find that the story of civilization is not a single, straight line. Humanity is endlessly creative, and in the dark, isolated corners of the globe, people were solving the exact same problems in completely bizarre, wildly different ways. Let us travel to the continent of Africa to look at the undeniable kings of ancient stone and the strange, fascinating neighbors they left in their shadow. Let us leave the rolling, wind-swept hills of Turkey and the dawn of agriculture behind. It is time to travel south, following the ancient migratory paths until we hit the most famous, most fiercely debated stretch of sand on the entire planet. We are following the Nile River into the blazing heart of ancient Africa. When you hear the word civilization, your brain almost certainly conjures a very specific, iconic image. You see the Great Pyramid of Giza, shimmering like a golden mirage under the relentless Egyptian sun. You picture god-kings with golden death masks, mummies wrapped in linen, and colossal statues staring blankly out across the desert. The ancient Egyptians are the undisputed kings of the ancient world in our popular imagination. But because their achievements are so massive, so impossibly heavy, they have also become the ultimate magnet for the wildest conspiracy theories on Earth. If you spend enough time on the internet or watching late-night cable television, you will inevitably encounter the ancient aliens theory regarding the pyramids. The argument always follows the same seductive logic. The Great Pyramid is made of over 2 million blocks of limestone and granite, some weighing up to 80 tons. The joints between these massive stones are so perfectly cut that you cannot slip a modern razor blade between them. Therefore, primitive men in skirts wielding soft copper tools could not possibly have built it. They must have had help. They must have possessed acoustic levitation devices, anti-gravity beams, or extraterrestrial laser cutters. It is a fun story, but it completely insults the sheer, terrifying willpower of human beings. To debunk the alien laser theory, we do not need to look at the sky. We need to look at the dirt, and we need to look at the garbage. Let us travel back to the year 2500 BC, to the Giza Plateau during the construction of the Great Pyramid of the Pharaoh Khufu. We are not going to look at the king. We are going to walk down the hill, away from the glittering white limestone of the construction site, and step into the sprawling, noisy, chaotic workers' village. For decades, we assumed the pyramids were built by armies of brutally whipped slaves. Hollywood movies cemented this image in our minds. But modern archaeology has unearthed the tombs and the mess halls of the builders, and the truth is far more fascinating. These were not slaves. They were highly respected, well-fed, and incredibly skilled laborers, and we know exactly what they ate. Imagine walking into the massive, open-air catering tents of the workers' village. The smell is incredibly pungent. The air is thick with the scent of roasting prime beef, mutton, and massive quantities of garlic and onions. The Egyptians knew that feeding a workforce of 20,000 men required massive calories and protein to prevent exhaustion and disease. A worker sits down after a grueling 10-hour shift dragging stone. His hands are thick with calluses. His back is heavily muscled but plagued by arthritis, a condition we clearly see in their skeletal remains. He is handed a thick, gritty loaf of bread made from emmer wheat. Because the wheat was ground on stone slabs in the desert, fine desert sand inevitably mixed with the dough. Every time he takes a bite, the sand slowly grinds down his teeth. He washes it down with thick, dark, caloric beer. He is paid in this beer and bread. He is a proud contractor, working for the glory of his god-king and the economic stability of his family. But how did he cut the stone? The conspiracy theorists are right about one thing. The Egyptians only had soft copper tools, not hard iron or steel. If you take a soft copper chisel and hit a block of hard limestone, the copper bends and goes dull almost instantly. So how did they do it? They used the most abundant, annoying resource in Egypt: sand. The Egyptian stonemason did not use the copper saw to cut the stone directly. The copper was just the delivery mechanism. He would pour a mixture of water and hard, abrasive quartz sand into the groove. As he dragged the copper saw back and forth, the soft copper caught the sharp grains of sand, and the sand did the cutting, slowly grinding away the limestone. It was an agonizingly slow, rhythmic process. And for the incredibly hard granite used inside the king's burial chamber, they didn't use metal at all. They used a rock called dolerite, which is even harder than granite. Imagine holding a heavy, bowling ball-sized sphere of dolerite and rhythmically smashing it down onto the granite block, pulverizing the stone dust millimeter by millimeter, hour after hour, day after day. It is not acoustic levitation. It is brute force, infinite patience, and thousands of bleeding knuckles. And how did they move these mountains of stone? They let the river do the heavy lifting. Every year, the Nile River flooded its banks, an event called the inundation. During this time, the farmers could not work their fields, so they were drafted into the royal workforce. The floodwaters reached right up to the base of the Giza Plateau, turning it into a massive port. The heavy stones, quarried hundreds of miles to the south, were floated down the river on massive cedar barges, completely eliminating the need to drag them across miles of dry sand. The Great Pyramid is not a monument to aliens. It is a monument to human logistics, absolute centralized authority, and the unbelievable power of a unified society pulling on the same rope. But Egypt is not the only civilization that left a heavy footprint in the African sand. The shadows of the pharaohs are so long that they completely obscure a spectacular, rival empire located just to their south. Let us leave Giza, board a riverboat, and travel hundreds of miles up the Nile, deep into modern-day Sudan. As we travel south, the landscape changes. The lush, fertile banks of the Egyptian Nile give way to harsher, drier scrubland and deep red sands. We have crossed the ancient border into the kingdom of Kush, also known as Nubia. For centuries, historians treated Kush simply as Egypt's poorer, weaker neighbor, a place where the pharaohs went to mine gold and capture exotic animals. But this is a massive historical injustice. The kingdom of Kush was an absolute superpower in its own right. In fact, around 730 BC, the Kushite kings grew so powerful that they marched north, conquered Egypt entirely, and ruled as the mighty Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. If you step off the boat at the ancient Kushite capital of Meroe, you will see a skyline that looks incredibly familiar, yet distinctly bizarre. Rising out of the desolate, reddish-brown desert are pyramids, but they are not the sprawling, massive mountains of Giza. The pyramids of Meroe are much smaller, but incredibly steep, shooting up into the sky at sharp, dramatic angles. And there are dozens of them, clustered tightly together like a stone forest. In fact, there are more pyramids in modern-day Sudan than there are in Egypt. But the real power of Kush didn't come from building steep stone tombs. It came from something that the ancient Egyptians desperately lacked, something that smelled of sulfur, charcoal, and blistering heat. The kingdom of Kush was an industrial powerhouse of iron. If you walk through the ancient city of Meroe during its peak, the air is not filled with the smell of roasting garlic like in Egypt. It is filled with the thick, acrid black smoke of thousands of blazing furnaces. Everywhere you look, there are massive artificial hills made of dark, glassy rock. These are slag heaps, the toxic, molten waste product left over from smelting iron ore. The Kushites figured out how to generate the extreme, sustained temperatures needed to melt iron. While the rest of the ancient world was fighting with softer bronze, the Kushites were forging superior iron spearheads, iron agricultural tools that could easily break the hard soil, and iron axes to chop down the acacia forests to feed their endless furnaces. They were an empire built on fire and heavy metal, fiercely independent, wealthy from their control of trade routes into the deep African interior, and perfectly capable of standing toe-to-toe with the greatest empires of the Mediterranean. But to see how truly diverse human civilization can be, we need to leave the scorching heat, the massive stone monuments to death, and the roaring iron furnaces of Africa. We need to cross the sparkling blue expanse of the Mediterranean Sea and set foot in Europe. We are traveling to the island of Crete, roughly around 1600 BC. We have arrived in the world of the Minoans. If you have spent your life studying the Sumerians, the Egyptians, or the Kushites, arriving in Minoan Crete feels like walking onto another planet. Every other ancient civilization we have discussed was obsessed with a few core things: massive temples for the gods, terrifying weapons of war, and giant, indestructible tombs for their dead kings. The Minoans didn't seem to care about any of that. Let us walk up the hill toward the palace of Knossos, the center of their vibrant maritime empire. The first thing you notice is a glaring, dangerous omission. There are no defensive walls. There are no watchtowers. There are no moat systems. In the brutal, violent Bronze Age, building a wealthy city without a wall was considered sheer suicide. But the Minoans were so incredibly dominant at sea, their navy so fast and untouchable, that they felt perfectly safe. The ocean was their wall. Instead of building fortresses, they built palaces of pleasure and commerce. Step inside the palace of Knossos. You are immediately disoriented. It is not a logical geometric grid like the Indus Valley. It is a massive, sprawling, multi-story labyrinth of hundreds of interconnected rooms, twisting corridors, and hidden courtyards. In fact, this dizzying architecture is where the ancient Greek myth of the Minotaur's labyrinth originated. The air here is fresh, smelling of salty sea breezes, pressed olive oil, and expensive saffron spice. Look at the walls. They are not covered in intimidating carvings of prisoners being executed, like in the Middle East. The Minoan walls are covered in spectacular, vibrant, wet plaster frescoes. You see bright blue dolphins swimming gracefully. You see elegant women with elaborate hairstyles and open bodices chatting in gardens. The art is joyous, fluid, and fiercely alive. And as you walk deeper into the palace, you hear the familiar rush of water. Just like the mysterious Indus Valley civilization thousands of miles to the east, the Minoans independently invented complex indoor plumbing. They had beautiful terracotta pipes delivering pressurized, clean drinking water to the palace, and a completely separate sewage system to carry waste away. But to truly understand the bizarre, adrenaline-fueled heart of the Minoan culture, we have to step out into the massive, sun-drenched central courtyard of the palace. The courtyard is packed with thousands of cheering, wildly excited people. They are not here to watch a military parade or a solemn religious sacrifice. They are here to watch the most dangerous, beautiful, and insane sport of the ancient world. They are here for the bull leaping. The gates open, and a massive, furious, half-ton bull charges into the dusty arena. This is not a Spanish bullfight where the animal is slowly killed. To the Minoans, the bull is sacred. It is a symbol of raw, unpredictable nature and tectonic power. Standing in the center of the arena are young Minoan athletes, both men and women, completely unarmed. As the massive beast spots them, it lowers its horns and charges at full speed, its hooves tearing up the dirt. At the very last possible microsecond, a young athlete does not jump out of the way. Instead, he runs directly at the charging beast. He reaches out, grabs the bull by its deadly, sweeping horns, and uses the massive kinetic energy of the animal tossing its head upward to violently catapult himself backward into the air. He performs a perfect, gravity-defying backflip over the length of the bull's spine, landing flawlessly on his feet behind the animal into the arms of a waiting teammate. It requires superhuman timing, absolute fearlessness, and a deep, intimate understanding of the animal. If you slip, if your grip fails, you are instantly gored and trampled to death. This was their obsession. Not conquering their neighbors, not building pyramids of stone, but conquering their own fear in a dance of life and death. The Minoans show us that a civilization does not have to be grim, militaristic, or obsessed with the afterlife to be considered great. They were artists, traders, plumbers, and acrobats, living a bright, vibrant existence right up until the earth cracked open. The volcano of Thera exploded, and the ocean rushed in to wipe their beautiful labyrinth clean off the map. We have explored the mud, the stone, the iron, and the frescoes of the old world. But half of the globe still remains entirely untouched by our journey. It is time to cross the massive, terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. We are heading into the deep jungles and high mountains of the Americas to discover civilizations that developed in total, absolute isolation, guided by a completely different set of stars. Let us leave the sun-drenched painted courtyards of the Minoans and the roaring iron furnaces of Africa far behind. We are now going to cross the massive, terrifying, and seemingly endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. We are stepping completely off the map of the known ancient world. For over 10,000 years, the land masses of North and South America existed in a state of total, absolute quarantine. The people who migrated here during the last ice age were cut off from the rest of humanity by rising sea levels. Because of this isolation, The civilizations that sprouted in the Americas developed under a completely different set of rules. They did not have the wheel for transportation. They did not have horses, oxen, or any large beasts of burden to pull plows or wagons. They did not forge steel or iron swords. By the harsh, unforgiving metrics of the Old World, they should have remained primitive, scattered tribes living quietly in the dirt. But humanity does not like to stay quiet. Instead of remaining in the shadows, these isolated people built some of the most complex, mathematically brilliant, and fiercely mysterious empires the planet has ever seen. Imagine standing deep in the suffocating, steaming jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula or the lowlands of Guatemala, roughly around the year 600 AD. The air here is incredibly heavy, thick with humidity, and the sharp scent of decaying orchids and wet earth. The canopy of the rainforest is so dense that it blocks out the sun, plunging the forest floor into a perpetual emerald twilight. Above you, the terrifying, guttural roar of howler monkeys echoes through the mahogany trees. It feels like a place where human beings simply should not survive, let alone thrive. But then, you hack through a thick wall of vines, and the jungle suddenly opens up. Rising out of the green shadows is a magnificent, sprawling city. This is the realm of the Maya. The towering, stepped pyramids are not the faded gray stone we see today. In their prime, these massive structures were coated in thick, smooth stucco and painted a blinding, blood-red color that could be seen from miles away. The city is alive with the sounds of tens of thousands of people, bustling markets, and the heavy rhythmic chanting of priests. The Maya are perhaps the most misunderstood civilization in history. Because they lived in the jungle and practiced bloodletting and human sacrifice, modern pop culture often paints them as a society of savage, bloodthirsty warriors. But look past the sacrificial altars, and you will find an empire built entirely on an obsession with the sky. The Maya were the greatest naked-eye astronomers in human history. They did not have glass lenses. They did not possess a single telescope. Yet, from the dense, suffocating floor of the rainforest, they managed to map the complex movements of the cosmos with a level of terrifying pinpoint precision that rivaled modern computers. How did they do it without modern instruments? Imagine a Maya priest astronomer. He does not look through a tube. Instead, he uses the architecture of his city as a massive, immobile telescope. He builds a specific stone temple. Then, miles away across the jungle canopy, he builds another structure. He stands at a specific doorway on a specific day of the year and sights a line perfectly across the top of a distant wooden crossed stick, aligning it exactly with a notch on the distant temple. By patiently, obsessively watching where the sun, the moon, and the planets rose and set against these architectural crosshairs, night after night, generation after generation, they gathered massive, pristine data sets. They tracked the incredibly complex, erratic orbit of the planet Venus, with an error rate of only 2 hours over a span of 500 years. To process this massive amount of astronomical data, you need advanced mathematics. The Romans, with all their military might and engineering brilliance, used a clunky, clumsy numbering system, Roman numerals, that made complex multiplication and division an absolute nightmare. The Maya, living isolated in the jungle, independently invented one of the most powerful mathematical concepts in the universe. the concept of zero. They used a beautiful, elegant counting system based on dots and bars, allowing them to calculate numbers into the hundreds of millions. And they used this math to build the infamous Maya calendar. If you were alive and browsing the internet in the years leading up to 2012, you remember the absolute global panic. Countless conspiracy theories, documentaries, and Hollywood blockbuster movies claimed that the ancient Maya had predicted the exact date the world would end. December 21st, 2012. People genuinely believed that the Maya, with their mystical jungle wisdom, knew a comet was coming, or that the Earth's magnetic poles would violently flip, erasing humanity. The truth is far less cinematic, but deeply revealing about how we project our own modern anxieties onto the past. The Maya had several calendars operating at the same time, like interlocking gears. They had a sacred 260-day calendar for religious rituals and a 365-day solar calendar for agriculture. But for tracking deep cosmic time, they used the long count. The long count calendar was designed to measure the sheer weight of eternity. It was a massive count of days since their mythical date of creation, which correlates to August 11th, 3114 BC. So, what actually happened on December 21st, 2012? Imagine you are driving an old, reliable car. The odometer on your dashboard has 5 digits. You have been driving this car for a very long time, and the mileage is reading 99,999. You drive 1 more mile. What happens? The car does not explode. The engine does not catch fire. The odometer simply clicks over, resetting to 00000, and a new cycle begins. That is exactly what the Maya long count calendar did in 2012. It reached the end of a massive 5,125-year cycle known as a Baktun, and simply clicked over to start the next one. The Maya never wrote a single hieroglyph predicting the end of the world. In fact, archaeologists have found inscriptions where Maya kings confidently boasted about celebrating anniversaries thousands of years after the year 2012. The 2012 doomsday myth was a modern conspiracy theory, born from a complete misunderstanding of how ancient, cyclical time worked. The Maya were not prophets of doom. They were brilliant, patient scientists trying to find mathematical order in a chaotic universe. But if you want to find the true epicenter of modern conspiracy theories, the undisputed holy grail of the ancient aliens crowd, we must leave the humid, suffocating jungles of Central America. We must travel thousands of miles south, climbing out of the lowlands and up into the dizzying, freezing heights of the Andes Mountains in South America. We are traveling to the Altiplano of Bolivia, a desolate, high-altitude plateau sitting near the shimmering, freezing waters of Lake Titicaca. The air here, at an elevation of 13,000 feet, is dangerously thin. It is hard to breathe, let alone engage in grueling physical labor. The landscape is stark, rocky, and utterly unforgiving. Here, scattered across the red dirt like the discarded toys of an angry giant, lie the ruins of Pumapunku. Pumapunku is a massive, ancient temple complex constructed by the Tiwanaku Empire roughly 1,500 years ago. When you walk onto the site today, it does not look like a neat, organized ruin. It looks like a bomb went off. Massive slabs of red sandstone and gray volcanic rock are thrown about in chaotic heaps. But when you walk up to one of these broken gray stones, your brain immediately stops accepting what your eyes are seeing. The ruins are famous for the H blocks, massive, intricately carved stones that look exactly like the letter H. These are not rough, chipped boulders. The surfaces of the stone are perfectly flat, feeling almost like smooth glass to the touch. The inside corners of the cuts are impossibly sharp, perfectly right-angled, 90-degree turns. Along the faces of the stone, there are perfectly straight, narrow grooves, and inside those grooves there are small, perfectly cylindrical holes drilled deep into the rock, spaced out with mathematical precision. The stone they used is andesite. Andesite is an incredibly hard, dense volcanic rock. It is notoriously difficult to carve, even for a modern stonemason with power tools. When modern conspiracy theorists, engineers, and television hosts look at the H-blocks of Puma Punku, they throw their hands in the air. They declare, confidently, that it is physically impossible for a society wearing llama wool ponchos and wielding bronze chisels to create this level of precision. The cuts look machined. They look exactly like the output of a modern computer-controlled CNC milling machine. Therefore, the theory goes, the people of Tiwanaku did not build it. They couldn't have. They must have been visited by extraterrestrials, or perhaps a highly advanced lost human civilization from the Ice Age, who used high-powered laser cutters, diamond-tipped power drills, and anti-gravity technology to effortlessly slice through the andesite like hot knives through butter. It is a deeply compelling narrative because it feeds our desire for magic. But it is completely false. And worse, it insults the staggering, agonizing genius of our ancestors. We can completely debunk the laser cutter theory right now, using nothing but dirt, basic physics, and a simple thought experiment that you could replicate in your own garage. How do you achieve a perfectly flat, glass-smooth surface on a massive block of super-hard andesite without a laser? You use the same brutal, patient method the Egyptians used, but you refine it. You do not try to cut the hard stone with a softer metal tool. If the Tiwanaku stonemasons took a soft copper or bronze chisel and hit the andesite, the chisel would bend and become completely useless on the very first strike. Instead, they used the ultimate ancient laser: friction. Imagine you take a large, rough slab of andesite. You want to make it perfectly flat. First, you use a heavy, round pounding stone, a rock harder than andesite, and you violently smash the surface for days, breaking off the largest bumps. Then, you bring in the magic ingredient. You shovel a layer of fine, sharp quartz sand onto the stone, and you add a little bit of water to make an abrasive slurry. Next, you take a heavy, flat piece of wood, or a flat, smooth, planing stone. You place it on top of the wet sand. And then, you push it back and forth. You push it, pull it, push it, pull it. The wood or the flat stone does not cut the andesite. Instead, the wood catches the tiny, razor-sharp grains of quartz sand, holding them in place, while the sheer weight and motion drag the sand across the surface of the block. The sand is the saw. This process is agonizingly slow. It takes thousands upon thousands of hours of rhythmic, mind-numbing labor. But over weeks and months of grinding, the surface of that block will become perfectly, flawlessly flat. The water and the microscopic stone dust polish the andesite until it feels smooth as glass. No lasers required. Just infinite patience. But what about the impossibly sharp 90-degree internal corners? The ones that look like they were cut by a machine? The conspiracy theorists claim that ancient people couldn't measure a perfect right angle, but measuring a 90-degree angle does not require a microchip. It requires 3 pieces of straight wood tied together to form a triangle, a basic tri-square. A master stonemason would simply hold his wooden square against the corner. If he saw light peeking through, he knew it wasn't perfectly straight. So he would add a pinch more sand, take a thin, flat piece of copper, and carefully grind the corner a few more 100 times until the light disappeared. It is not alien technology. It is simply an extreme, obsessive commitment to quality control. And finally, the ultimate proof of the ancient aliens, the perfectly drilled, smooth, cylindrical holes inside the grooves of the stone. Surely you need a diamond-tipped Black & Decker power drill for that? Absolutely not. You need a stick, a string, a hollow reed, and more sand. The Tiwanaku builders used a bow drill. Imagine a small, flexible wooden bow, like you would use to shoot an arrow. The string of the bow is wrapped once around a straight, vertical wooden shaft. At the bottom of this shaft, you attach a hollow piece of copper tubing, or even just a hard, hollow reed. You place the hollow tube against the rock. You pour your abrasive wet sand into the tube. Then, you rapidly pump the bow back and forth. The string spins the shaft at high speed. The spinning copper tube catches the sand, and the sand grinds a perfectly smooth, circular hole straight down into the hard rock. Because the tube is hollow, it leaves a small, perfectly round core of stone in the center, which can easily be snapped off, leaving a flawless, cylindrical hole. Modern experimental archaeologists have recreated this exact process on video, using nothing but sticks, copper, sand, and elbow grease. They have perfectly replicated the impossible laser cuts of Pumapunku. This is the great tragedy of the ancient aliens theory. When we look at a masterpiece like Pumapunku and say, humans couldn't do that, we are drastically underestimating what human beings are capable of when they have a unified purpose and an infinite amount of time. The people of Tiwanaku did not have smartphones to distract them. They did not punch a clock at 5 p.m. Their entire lives, their religion, and their social standing were intimately bound to the perfection of these stones. The real magic of Pumapunku is not that it was built by aliens from the Sirius star system. The real, terrifying magic is that it was built by human beings who simply refused to quit grinding. We have explored the grand empires, the mathematically obsessed stargazers, and the masters of stone. But our journey through the history of human civilization has one final massive blind spot. What happens when a civilization grows so vast, so incredibly populous, that it simply vanishes under its own weight? Would you like me to move on to Part 6, where we explore the bizarre, out-of-place artifacts, OOP arts, like the Antikythera mechanism? Or shall we dive straight into Part 7 to uncover the hidden mega-cities swallowed by the Amazon rainforest? We have spent our journey looking at massive, immovable things. We have stared up at towering pyramids, traced the sweeping lines of ancient walls, and marveled at the heavy, silent stones dragged across the dirt by thousands of exhausted hands. But sometimes, the most terrifying ghosts of the past are small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. Imagine you are an archaeologist digging through a medieval knight's tomb in England, and right next to a rusted iron broadsword, you find a perfectly preserved iPhone. your brain would completely short-circuit. It violates the linear, predictable flow of time. It is an object that simply has no right to exist in that era. In the fringes of archaeology, these impossible objects have a name. They are called OOP arts, out-of-place artifacts. To the conspiracy theorists, the ancient alien believers, and the alternative historians, OOP arts are the ultimate smoking gun. They are the undeniable proof that our timeline is wrong, that highly advanced technology existed thousands of years ago, or that time travelers have accidentally dropped their gadgets into the muddy puddles of antiquity. Let us dim the lights and examine the three most famous, most fiercely debated OOP arts in the world. We will look at the impossible magic they seem to possess, and then we will expose them to the harsh, illuminating light of historical reality. Our first stop is the treacherous, storm-tossed waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The year is 1900. A group of Greek sponge divers, wearing heavy, terrifying canvas diving suits and brass helmets, are forced to take shelter from a violent storm off the coast of a tiny, rocky island called Antikythera. When the storm passes, they dive down into the deep, dark blue water to look for sponges. Instead, they find a graveyard. Scattered across the sloping ocean floor, at a depth of 150 feet, is the wreck of a massive Roman cargo ship that sank roughly 2,000 years ago. The divers recover beautiful bronze statues, amphorae of ancient wine, and sparkling glass. But mixed in with the treasure is a heavily corroded, crusty lump of green bronze and wood, roughly the size of a shoebox. For months, the lump sits in a museum courtyard, ignored. Then the wood dries up and cracks open, revealing a glimpse of what is inside. It is filled with precision-cut, interlocking bronze gears. For decades, scientists refused to believe what they were looking at. Gearing of this complexity, featuring differential gears and microscopic teeth, was not supposed to be invented until the clockmakers of Europe built intricate timepieces in the 14th century. Yet here was a machine, sitting in the mud for 2 millennia, boasting the mechanical complexity of an 18th century Swiss watch. When modern researchers finally put the Antikythera mechanism into a high-powered three-dimensional X-ray scanner, the conspiracy theories exploded. The scans revealed over 30 interlocking gears, covered in thousands of tiny, perfectly engraved Greek letters forming an instruction manual. It was not just a clock. It was a computer. The world's first known analog computer. The ancient alien theorists immediately claimed victory. They argued that a Roman sailor could not possibly possess the quantum mechanics required to build a laptop. Therefore, it must be the debris of a crashed UFO or a gift from a hyper-advanced lost Atlantean race. But the reality of the Antikythera mechanism is far more grounded and, in a way, far more thrilling. It does not prove that aliens visited Greece. It proves that we have drastically, insultingly underestimated the sheer, terrifying genius of the ancient human mind. The machine was a highly complex mechanical cosmos. By turning a small hand crank on the side, the user rotated the gears, which moved a series of pointers on the front and back dials. It tracked the exact position of the sun and the moon against the zodiac. It flawlessly calculated the erratic, shifting cycle of lunar eclipses decades in advance. It even had a small dial that tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. It was built by brilliant Hellenistic engineers, likely operating in the mathematical lineage of Archimedes himself. They did not have electricity, but they deeply understood the mathematics of the sky, and they translated that math into physical bronze. The tragedy of the Antikythera mechanism is not that it is an alien artifact. The tragedy is that this incredible technological lineage was lost, swallowed by the collapse of empires and the burning of libraries, setting human computational progress back by over 1,000 years. If the Antikythera mechanism is the ancient computer, our next artifact is supposed to be the ancient power source. Let us leave the ocean and travel to the dry, dusty plains of modern-day Iraq. In the late 1930s, an Austrian archaeologist named Wilhelm König was digging in an ancient village called Kujut Rabu, located just outside of Baghdad. The ruins belonged to the Parthian Empire, dating back to roughly 200 BC. König unearthed a small, incredibly unremarkable object. It was a simple 5-inch-tall clay jar of a pale yellow color. But when he looked inside, the mystery deepened. Fixed to the mouth of the jar with a tight seal of black asphalt was a hollow cylinder made of rolled copper. And suspended directly down the center of that copper cylinder, held in place by an asphalt plug so it would not touch the sides, was a heavily oxidized iron rod. To anyone with a basic understanding of high school chemistry, this setup looks violently familiar. It is the exact blueprint of a galvanic cell. It is a battery. If you take a replica of this exact jar, fill the copper cylinder with an acidic liquid commonly available in the ancient world, like grape juice, lemon juice, or wine vinegar, the chemical reaction between the acid, the copper, and the iron instantly generates an electrical current of about 1 to 2 volts. The alternative history community seized upon the Baghdad battery like a lightning bolt. If the Parthians had electricity 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta invented the modern battery, what were they powering? Were they using it to electroplate silver onto cheap jewelry to fool merchants? Or were they linking hundreds of these jars together in dark temples to power primitive, glowing electric lights, appearing as literal magic to the terrified peasants? It is an intoxicating, incredibly cool theory. But when you look closely at the dirt, the ancient electricity narrative completely shorts out. First, consider the design of the jar. The copper cylinder and the iron rod are completely sealed into the top of the jar with thick, hardened asphalt. This makes it a terrible battery. If you want to use it as a battery, you have to constantly pour in fresh acid and check the electrolyte levels. With the asphalt seal, you would have to violently smash the jar open every time the battery died. Furthermore, in the thousands of excavations across the Middle East, archaeologists have never found a single scrap of ancient copper wiring. You cannot have an electrical grid without wires. So if it is not a battery, what is it? The answer lies in the religious and cultural context of the ancient Middle East. Throughout this region, archaeologists have found countless identical jars. But instead of an iron rod hanging in an empty copper tube, these other jars contained decaying fragments of sacred papyrus scrolls. In ancient times, if you wanted to protect a highly valuable sacred text from the rot of moisture and the chewing of insects, you rolled it tightly around a wooden or iron stick. You slid that scroll into a protective copper tube, dropped the tube into a clay jar, and sealed the top perfectly tight with boiling pitch or asphalt. The Baghdad battery is almost certainly not an ancient Duracell. It is a time capsule. It is a protective, hermetically sealed vessel for a scroll that has long since rotted away, leaving behind an iron rod and a copper tube that just happen, by pure accidental chemistry, to look exactly like a battery. We look at it through the biased lens of our modern, electrified world, hallucinating high technology where there was only paper. But what if the ancient world actually left us a blueprint of their light bulbs? This brings us to our final, most visually stunning part. We must travel to the blistering heat of southern Egypt, to the breathtaking Temple of Hathor at Dendera. You must walk past the massive sandstone columns, bypass the grand halls, and descend into the suffocating, pitch-black subterranean crypts beneath the temple floors. Carved into the walls of this cramped, breathless space is a massive stone relief that makes modern electrical engineers stop dead in their tracks. The carving depicts several ancient Egyptian figures supporting a massive, transparent, bulbous object. It looks exactly, unequivocally, like an oversized modern incandescent light bulb, or perhaps a Crookes tube. At the base of the bulb, there is a lotus flower that looks exactly like a modern electrical socket. Emerging from the socket and running the entire length of the bulb is a wavy line that looks exactly like a glowing tungsten filament. Propping up the heavy bulb is a pillar with horizontal rings, which looks identically like a modern high-voltage ceramic insulator. And trailing away from the lotus socket is a long, braided rope that looks exactly like a heavy-duty power cable, plugging into a square box. The ancient alien theorists point to this carving and declare the case closed. They argue that the Egyptians must have had electric light bulbs. This, they claim, neatly solves a lingering archaeological mystery. How did the Egyptian artisans paint beautiful, intricate, colorful frescoes deep inside pitch-black tombs without leaving any black soot on the ceilings from their torches? They didn't use fire. They used the Dendera light. It is a flawless, perfect conspiracy theory, except for the fact that it completely ignores how ancient Egyptians actually thought, wrote, and lived. First, let's address the soot. The idea that Egyptian tombs have no soot is a complete myth. Many tombs are heavily stained with black carbon. For the pristine tombs, the Egyptians simply used lamps filled with castor oil or olive oil mixed with salt, which burns incredibly clean and produces almost zero smoke. No electricity required. Second, the Dendera light is not a schematic for a General Electric factory. It is a beautiful, highly complex religious poem carved into stone. To read ancient Egyptian art, you must understand their mythology. The light bulb is actually a representation of the womb of Nut, the sky goddess, or the protective envelope of the morning sun. The glowing filament inside the bulb is not metal. It is a snake. Specifically, it is the god Harsomptus, who often takes the form of a serpent emerging from a lotus flower, symbolizing creation, the dawn, and the birth of a new day. The electrical socket is that very lotus flower which the Egyptians revered because it closes its petals at night and reopens them to the sun every morning. The cable running across the floor is not a power cord. It is simply the long, stylized stem of the lotus plant. And the ceramic insulator holding up the bulb is the Djed pillar, one of the most common ubiquitous symbols in all of Egypt. It represents the spine of the god Osiris, symbolizing eternal stability and strength. When a modern person looks at the wall at Dendera, they see a light bulb because they live in a world illuminated by electricity. When an ancient Egyptian priest looked at that exact same wall, they saw a deeply spiritual story about the snake of creation blooming from the lotus of the dawn, supported by the eternal spine of the gods. Out-of-place artifacts are fascinating, not because they prove aliens built our world, but because they act as a mirror. They reflect our own modern arrogance. We desperately want to believe that our ancestors were secretly using our technology because we cannot fathom a world where incredible, breathtaking genius existed without a microchip. But as we leave the subterranean crypts and step back out into the sun, we must face a much darker reality. It does not matter how brilliant an ancient computer was, or how beautiful the mythology of the sun could be, because when the climate shifts or the rivers dry up, even the most brilliant civilizations are reduced to dust. Let us look at the empires that the earth simply swallowed whole. We have spent a great deal of time examining the heavy, undeniable artifacts of human history. We have looked at stones weighing dozens of tons, perfectly aligned to the stars, and intricate bronze machines resting on the ocean floor. These things survived because they were made of materials that actively resist the relentless grinding of time. But what happens when an entire civilization chooses to build not with stone or metal, but with earth, wood, and vines? What happens when millions of people thrive in an environment so aggressively alive that it can swallow a skyscraper in a matter of decades? To answer that, we must venture into the most misunderstood, mythologized, and intimidating ecosystem on planet Earth. We are going to the Amazon rainforest. For centuries, modern biologists, historians, and explorers looked at the Amazon basin and saw a pristine, untouched wilderness. They called it a green hell. The conventional scientific wisdom was absolute. The soil in the Amazon is incredibly thin and highly acidic. Because the heavy rains constantly wash away the nutrients, the land simply cannot support large-scale, intensive agriculture. Therefore, the experts concluded, the Amazon could only ever support small, scattered primitive tribes of hunter-gatherers. But there was a lingering ghost story. In the year 1541, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana sailed down the massive Amazon River. When he finally emerged and returned to Europe, he told a terrifying, unbelievable tale. He did not describe an empty, howling wilderness. He reported seeing massive, sprawling, highly organized cities lining the riverbanks. He described complex road networks, millions of people, and vast agricultural fields stretching as far as the eye could see. For over 400 years, historians laughed at Orellana. They called him a liar, a man desperate to invent a wealthy empire to secure more funding from the Spanish crown. They looked at the dense, unbroken green canopy of the jungle and declared that no such cities ever existed. They were wrong. Orellana was telling the exact, terrifying truth. It was not until the 21st century, when scientists began flying airplanes over the Amazon equipped with a technology called LiDAR, that the ghost cities finally revealed themselves. LiDAR is essentially a magical, high-tech flashlight. It fires millions of laser pulses down through the dense jungle canopy, mapping the exact contours of the ground beneath the trees, effectively stripping away the leaves and vines in a 3D computer model. When researchers looked at the LiDAR maps of the Amazon, They were paralyzed by shock. Beneath the seemingly untouched, wild jungle was a staggering, continent-sized network of geometric earthworks. The Amazon was not a pristine wilderness. It was a massive, ancient, and highly engineered garden. Let us travel back to the year 1490, just before the arrival of the Europeans. We are in the Xingu region of the Amazon. If you were to walk through this area, you would not be hacking your way through untamed vines with a machete. You would be walking on a massive, perfectly straight, elevated dirt highway, stretching for miles, connecting one massive circular plaza to another. The people who lived here did not build with stone, because there is no stone in the deep jungle. They built massive palisaded wooden walls and towering thatched roof structures. But how did they feed millions of people on the terrible acidic jungle soil? They engineered a miracle. They created something called terra preta, or dark earth. The ancient Amazonians engaged in a massive generational project of soil transformation. They took thousands of tons of charcoal from their low-heat cooking fires, mixed it with broken pottery shards, animal bones, and compost, and systematically buried it in the earth. Over centuries, this process completely altered the chemical composition of the ground, creating deep, incredibly rich black soil that retained nutrients and moisture, allowing them to grow massive surpluses of maize, squash, and fruit trees. They also dug massive geometric trenches and canals, altering the flow of the rivers to create massive fish farms, raising thousands of turtles and fish in perfectly managed aquatic pens. They had conquered the green hell. They had built a sustainable, thriving, interconnected mega-civilization, boasting a population estimated at upwards of 10 million people. So, where did they go? Why did the jungle swallow them? The answer is one of the darkest tragedies in human history. When the Europeans arrived on the coast of South America, they brought something far more devastating than swords or gunpowder. They brought invisible, microscopic assassins, smallpox, measles, and influenza. Because the people of the Americas had lived in total isolation for over 10,000 years, they had absolutely zero genetic immunity to Old World diseases. Before the Spanish explorers even had a chance to march deep into the Amazon to find these great wooden cities, the diseases traveled ahead of them, carried rapidly up the rivers by indigenous trade networks. The plagues swept through the densely packed Amazonian cities like a raging, invisible fire. It is estimated that up to 90% of the population was wiped out in a matter of years. The grand cities were suddenly silenced. The massive agricultural fields were abandoned, and the Amazon rainforest, which is relentless, aggressive, and incredibly fast-growing, immediately moved in to reclaim its stolen territory. Within 50 years, the wooden walls rotted away. The towering trees violently ripped through the plazas. The vines covered the raised highways. By the time the next wave of explorers arrived, the cities were completely gone, hidden beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of green, leaving nothing but a lingering, discredited legend of a lost world. If the Amazon shows us how quickly an empire of wood can vanish, our next destination shows us how a monument of pure dirt can hide in plain sight. Let us leave the steaming heat of South America and travel north, into the heartland of the United States. We are crossing the mighty Mississippi River and stepping into the fertile, grassy floodplains of Illinois, just a few miles from modern-day St. Louis. The year is 1150 A.D. In the popular imagination, pre-Columbian North America was a vast, empty expanse, populated only by small, scattered bands of nomadic hunters chasing buffalo. But as you walk onto this floodplain in the year 1150, you are not looking at a small camp. You are looking at a roaring, bustling metropolis. You have entered the city of Cahokia. At its peak, Cahokia was a sprawling urban center covering over 6 square miles, home to an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 people. To put that into perspective, in the year 1150, Cahokia was significantly larger and more populous than London, England. It was a city of neighborhoods, massive open plazas, astronomical observatories made of red cedar posts, known today as Woodhenge, and bustling markets where traders exchanged copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. But the undisputed heart of the city, dominating the skyline like a man-made mountain, was Monk's Mound. When you stand at the base of Monk's Mound, your brain struggles to comprehend the sheer scale of the labor involved. It is a towering, flat-topped pyramid made entirely of packed earth. It covers an astonishing 14 acres at its base, making its footprint larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises in 4 massive terraces to a height of 100 feet. Imagine the agonizing, brutal reality of its construction. The people of Cahokia did not have wheels, carts, or beasts of burden. Every single ounce of the 22 million cubic feet of earth used to build this artificial mountain was moved by human hands. Picture a massive, unending line of workers, their backs bending under the brutal summer sun, carrying woven baskets filled with 50 pounds of wet, heavy river mud. They walked up the steep slopes, dumped the mud, stamped it down with their feet, and walked back down to the river to do it again. Millions upon millions of times. On top of this colossal earthen platform stood a massive, 50-foot-tall wooden structure, likely the residence of a powerful central ruler, or a grand temple where priests conducted ceremonies that could be seen by the tens of thousands of citizens gathered in the grand plaza below. Cahokia was the shining capital of the Mississippian culture, a complex agricultural society that dominated the river valleys of North America. Yet, by the year 1350, just a few centuries after it reached its magnificent peak, Cahokia was completely abandoned. Why? There are no signs of a massive invasion. There are no layers of ash suggesting the city was burned to the ground by enemies. The most likely culprit was a devastating combination of environmental exhaustion and climate change. The Cahokians had grown too large. They had chopped down all the surrounding forests for miles to build their massive palisade walls and fuel their cooking fires. Without trees to hold the soil in place, catastrophic flooding from the Mississippi River repeatedly destroyed their crops. At the same time, the climate began to cool down, leading to shortened growing seasons and massive localized droughts. When the crops failed, the magic of the ruling class failed. The massive population could no longer be fed. The complex social structure simply unraveled. The people quietly packed up their belongings, abandoned their massive earthen mountain, and dispersed back into the surrounding landscape, forming the smaller Native American tribes that European settlers would encounter centuries later. Over the centuries, the wooden buildings on top of Monk's Mound rotted away. Grass and trees grew over the terraced steps. The Great Pyramid of North America simply disguised itself as a natural, gently sloping hill, sleeping silently in the tall grass. We have seen the hidden networks of the Amazon and the earthen mountains of Illinois. For our final hidden empire, we must return to the African continent, traveling far south of the Egyptian sands and the Kushite iron furnaces. We are traveling to the modern-day country of Zimbabwe. We are looking for a city made of stone, built in a way that defies architectural logic. During the late 19th century, European colonial explorers pushing into southern Africa stumbled upon a sprawling, magnificent complex of ancient stone ruins. They called it Great Zimbabwe. The European explorers, blinded by the intense racial prejudices of their era, looked at the massive, intricately constructed stone walls and flatly refused to believe that the local indigenous African people could have built it. They hallucinated wild, offensive conspiracy theories, claiming that Great Zimbabwe must have been built by the ancient Phoenicians, the Arabs, or that it was the legendary, lost biblical city of Ophir, where King Solomon mined his gold. It took decades of fierce archaeological battles to force the world to accept the undeniable, scientific truth. Great Zimbabwe was built entirely by the ancestors of the local Shona people, beginning around the 11th century. And what they built is an absolute masterpiece of engineering. If you want to build a heavy stone or brick wall today, you use mortar. Mortar is the wet, cement-like paste that acts as a forgiving glue. It holds the irregular bricks together, fills in the gaps, and compensates for your mistakes. The builders of Great Zimbabwe did not use a single drop of mortar. They used a technique called dry stone construction, but they took it to a level of terrifying, obsessive perfection. The heart of the city is a massive structure called the Great Enclosure. Its outer wall is over 800 feet long, stands a dizzying 32 feet high, and is up to 17 feet thick at its base. To build this without glue requires an unbelievable mastery of physics and gravity. The stonemasons painstakingly heated massive granite boulders with raging fires, then rapidly splashed them with cold water, causing the rock to violently fracture into relatively flat, manageable slabs. Then they began to stack them. Every single block had to be carefully selected, slightly chipped, and perfectly placed so that its weight locked the blocks below it into place. The walls curve gracefully, leaning slightly inward for structural stability. To walk alongside the great enclosure is to walk next to millions of individual stones, held together by nothing but friction, gravity, and absolute, localized genius. Inside the walls stands a solid, massive conical tower, 30 feet high, shaped exactly like a massive stone grain silo. It has no doors, no windows, and no interior chambers. It is a solid monument to agricultural wealth and royal power. At its height in the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe was a thriving, incredibly wealthy metropolis of up to 18,000 people. It was the pulsing heart of a massive global trade network. When archaeologists carefully sifted through the dirt inside the stone enclosures, they didn't just find local African artifacts. They found glass beads from India. They found brass coins from the Islamic caliphates of Arabia. They found beautifully painted, delicate porcelain plates from the Ming dynasty of China. The kings of Great Zimbabwe were not isolated. They controlled the massive, lucrative flow of gold and ivory from the deep African interior down to the trading ports on the Indian Ocean coast. They were sitting at the dinner table of the global medieval economy. But just like Cahokia and the cities of the Amazon, the stone walls could not protect them from the environment. By the 15th century, the massive population had exhausted the local resources. The surrounding land was overgrazed by their massive herds of cattle. The forests were depleted for firewood, and salt became scarce. The city slowly strangled itself. The trade routes shifted, the wealth dried up, and the people migrated north, leaving their beautiful, perfectly stacked walls behind to be swallowed by the tall African savanna grass. These three forgotten empires, the wooden metropolises of the Amazon, the earthen pyramids of Cahokia, and the dry stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, teach us a profoundly humbling lesson. It does not matter how many millions of people you govern, how much earth you move, or how perfectly you cut your stone. Civilization is a fragile, temporary agreement we make with nature. And nature is incredibly patient. It will always wait for the agreement to expire, and then it will slowly, quietly take the land back. But how do modern scientists actually know this? How do we put exact dates on the deaths of these empires without written records? As we move into Part 8, we will demystify the complex, seemingly magical tools of modern archaeology and show you exactly how the time detectives pull the truth out of the dirt. We have traveled across continents and through thousands of years of history. We have seen magnificent empires swallowed by the suffocating mud of river valleys, completely erased by the relentless green vines of the jungle, and silently buried beneath the tall, swaying grasses of the African savanna. But as we look at these ruins, a deeply logical question arises. How do we actually know any of this? How do we look at a collapsed, unrecognizable pile of dirt in Illinois, or a scattered pile of stones in Zimbabwe, and confidently state to the world, this was built exactly 876 years ago? The answer is that modern archaeologists are no longer just romantic treasure hunters, with dusty fedoras, shovels, and a good sense of intuition. They have evolved into forensic time detectives. They are armed with technology that, to an ancient mind, would appear to be absolute, terrifying magic. Let us open the detective's toolkit and look at the two most powerful, revolutionary instruments in modern archaeology. We will explain them not with dense academic jargon, but with simple, everyday metaphors. First, let us look at the tool that completely revolutionized how we find lost worlds. It is called LiDAR. For centuries, finding a lost city in a place like the Amazon basin or the Central American Maya lowlands was pure, miserable agony. Imagine being an explorer in the 1920s. You have a sharp machete, a heavy compass, and a terrible case of malaria. You hack your way through a dense, insect-infested jungle for 6 agonizing months, and you might only uncover a single crumbling stone wall. You could literally be standing 50 feet away from a massive, towering pyramid, but the vegetation is so thick, the canopy so dark, that you would never even see it. The jungle is the ultimate fortress. It keeps its secrets incredibly well. Enter LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. To understand LiDAR, do not think of it as a complex laser array. Think of LiDAR simply as a magic X-ray flashlight that completely strips bare the forest canopy. Here is exactly how it works. An archaeological team straps a massive, heavy laser scanner to the bottom of a small airplane or a modern drone. As the pilot flies the aircraft back and forth over the thick, impenetrable canopy of the rainforest, the machine fires millions of tiny, invisible laser pulses down at the ground every single second. Most of these laser beams hit the thick leaves, the thick branches, and the trunks of the mahogany trees, and they bounce right back up to the sensor on the airplane. But a tiny, microscopic fraction of those light beams manage to slip through the tiny gaps in the leaves. They travel all the way down, hit the actual dirt of the forest floor, and bounce back. The computer inside the airplane measures the exact microsecond it takes for every single beam of light to return, acting very much like a bat using biological echolocation in the dark. Then, the scientists land the plane, download the data, and do something miraculous. With the push of a button on their keyboard, the computer simply deletes every single laser point that bounced off a tree. Instantly, the entire jungle vanishes from the screen. The thick canopy is digitally peeled away, leaving only a perfect, high-resolution, three-dimensional topographical map of the bare ground underneath. Suddenly, those gentle, natural-looking hills are revealed to be perfectly square, terraced pyramids. Those random dips in the dirt are exposed as massive, geometric agricultural canals and raised highways. In a single afternoon of flying, this magic flashlight can discover more ancient ruins, map more hidden cities, and reveal more human infrastructure than 1,000 men with machetes could find in a century of backbreaking labor. It is the ultimate tool for finding exactly where the ghosts are hiding in the dark. So, LiDAR tells the time detectives where the ancient cities are. But how do we know when they were built? How did the scientists know that the spectacular stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe were carved exactly 11,600 years ago? For that, we do not look at the shape of the stones, because rocks do not have a birthday. We must look inside the dead biological material left behind by the builders. We use a process called radiocarbon dating, specifically measuring carbon-14. To understand carbon-14 dating, you have to imagine an invisible, microscopic hourglass sitting inside the cells of every single living thing on Earth. High up in the Earth's upper atmosphere, cosmic rays originating from deep space are constantly, relentlessly bombarding our air. This cosmic radiation collides with nitrogen gas, transforming it into a rare, slightly radioactive version of carbon called carbon-14. This radioactive carbon eventually mixes with oxygen to form radioactive carbon dioxide. Now follow the food chain. Trees, bushes, and wild grass breathe in that carbon dioxide. An ancient, massive, woolly mammoth comes along and eats the grass. An ancient human hunter comes along, spears the mammoth, and cooks the meat over a blazing wood fire. As long as a creature is alive, it is constantly eating and breathing. Therefore, the top half of its microscopic, biological hourglass is constantly being topped off with fresh carbon-14 from the environment. The ratio of normal, stable carbon to radioactive carbon-14 inside the living human, the living mammoth, and the living tree stays perfectly balanced with the atmosphere around them. But the exact second that tree is chopped down for firewood, or the exact second that human hunter takes his final breath, the biological system permanently shuts down. They stop eating. They stop breathing. The top of the hourglass is sealed, permanently shut. Because carbon-14 is radioactive, it is fundamentally unstable. Over time, it slowly, steadily decays back into nitrogen. The radioactive sand in the hourglass begins to drain into the bottom half. And here is the genius of the universe. It drains at an incredibly precise, mathematically perfect rate. Scientists know that it takes exactly 5,730 years for exactly half of the carbon-14 in a dead biological sample to disappear. This specific duration is known as its half-life. So, when an archaeologist digs deep into the dirt and finds a charred piece of firewood from an ancient campfire, a woven reed basket, or a bone fragment from an ancient tomb, they carefully package it and send it to a laboratory. The scientists in the lab do not need a time machine to visit the past. They simply use a mass spectrometer to count how many grains of radioactive sand are left in the sample. If the ancient bone only has exactly half of the carbon-14 it should have had when it was walking around alive, the detective knows immediately, without a shadow of a doubt, that the creature died roughly 5,730 years ago. If the sample only has a quarter of its sand left, it died over 11,000 years ago. It is the ultimate, undeniable forensic clock. It cannot be fooled by fake historical records written by boastful kings. It cannot be swayed by mythological stories of floods, and it completely shatters modern conspiracy theories. It is the raw, unarguable physics of the universe, ticking away silently in the darkness of the grave, just waiting for us to find it and read the time. Armed with the magic flashlight of LiDAR to strip away the present environment, and the atomic hourglass of carbon-14 to perfectly measure the deep past, we are no longer just guessing at shadows. We are finally able to truly calculate the staggering lifespan of human ambition. But measuring the past also forces us to face a terrifying, inescapable pattern. With these tools, we can see exactly how these hundreds of grand empires rose from the mud. And more importantly, as we move into Part 9, we can see exactly how they all inevitably died. When we take all of these incredible, high-tech tools, the magical forest-stripping lasers of LiDAR and the ticking atomic clocks of carbon-14, and we point them at the ruins of the past, we do not just see how these ancient people lived, we see exactly how they died. And as we sift through the ashes of hundreds of fallen empires, a terrifying, undeniable pattern begins to emerge. It doesn't matter if you build your city out of mud, out of wood, or out of massive blocks of solid granite. It does not matter if you pray to a sun god, a river god, or the stars. The formula for the doom of all civilizations is entirely physical. It is a harsh, unforgiving equation driven by the environment. The first great killer of empires is not an invading army with bronze swords. It is simply the movement of water. We look at rivers today and assume they are permanent fixtures on the map, carved deeply into the earth. But in geologic time, a river is a restless, thrashing snake. Let us look back at the people of the Indus Valley, who built those magnificent, perfectly gridded cities with their advanced indoor plumbing and massive brick sewers. They built their entire society around the predictable flow of the mighty Sarasvati River. But rivers carry millions of tons of heavy silt, microscopic pieces of sand and dirt washed down from the mountains. Over centuries, this silt slowly builds up on the riverbed, choking the flow of the water. Then, all it takes is a minor tectonic shift, a tiny earthquake deep underground that barely rattles a teacup, to slightly tilt the elevation of the land. The river hits the buildup of silt, finds a path of lesser resistance, and simply violently jumps its banks. It carves a completely new channel, moving perhaps 50 miles to the east. For the ancient city, this is an instant, unrecoverable death sentence. The physical reality of this shift is brutal. A farmer wakes up, walks to the irrigation canal that has watered his family's wheat fields for 10 generations, and finds only cracked, baking mud. Without water, the massive agricultural surplus vanishes in a single season. The granaries empty. The sophisticated plumbing systems dry up and become useless. The people cannot drink bricks. So they abandon the flawless geometry of their city and walk away into the dust. If the water doesn't move away, sometimes it simply stops falling from the sky entirely. Deep in the jungles of Central America, the brilliant Maya civilization was brought to its knees, not by war, but by the sky turning completely, mercilessly blue. Climatologists studying ancient lake mud have discovered that around the year 900 AD, the Maya lowlands were hit by a series of catastrophic mega-droughts, some lasting for decades. Imagine the physical horror of a mega-drought in a jungle city of 100,000 people. The massive plaster-lined reservoirs that catch the seasonal rainwater slowly evaporate under the punishing tropical sun. The green corn stalks in the fields turn brown, wither, and turn to dust in the wind. The kings and priests, whose entire political legitimacy is based on their claimed ability to communicate with the rain gods and ensure a good harvest, perform frantic, desperate, bloodletting rituals. But the sky remains empty. When the physical calories run out, society breaks down into violent, localized warfare over the last remaining puddles of muddy water until the magnificent, red-painted pyramids are swallowed by the silence. But the most chilling formula for doom does not come from a river changing course or the rain refusing to fall. The most terrifying collapse happens when a civilization actively, physically destroys its own survival mechanism. To understand the ultimate lesson in resource depletion, we must travel to the most isolated piece of inhabited land on the entire planet. We are sailing into the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, to a tiny speck of volcanic rock known as Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. If you sail in a straight line from the coast of Chile, you will travel over 2,000 miles of unbroken, open ocean before you hit this tiny island. It is a closed system. There are no neighbors to trade with. There is nowhere to evacuate. When the first Polynesian explorers washed up on the shores of Rapa Nui around the year 900 AD, they did not find a barren, grassy rock. They found a lush, tropical paradise. The island was covered in a dense, towering forest of millions of massive palm trees. The ocean was teeming with dolphins and fish. The soil was incredibly rich, volcanic, and perfectly suited for growing sweet potatoes and bananas. The society exploded. The population grew rapidly, reaching an estimated 10 to 15,000 people, divided into various complex competing clans. And then they became obsessed. They became obsessed with building the moai. The moai are the iconic, massive stone heads and torsos that stare blankly inland, away from the sea. They were carved to honor the powerful ancestors of the clans. But carving a monolithic stone statue out of the island's volcanic tuff quarry is only the first step. You then have to move a 20-ton fragile piece of rock miles across rugged, uneven terrain and hoist it upright onto a massive stone platform. How do you physically move a massive stone without wheels or draft animals? You need wood. You need an immense, staggering amount of wood. The people of Rapa Nui marched into their pristine palm forests with stone axes. They chopped down the towering trees. They stripped the bark and used the massive trunks as wooden rollers to slide the heavy statues across the dirt. They harvested the tough fibers of the palm fronds and twisted them into thousands of feet of thick, heavy ropes to drag the stone and pull the statues upright. As the years passed, the clans engaged in a fierce, silent arms race. To prove their power, they began carving bigger and bigger moai. Some of the later statues weighed up to 80 tons. To move these monstrous stones, they had to cut down even more trees. It was a slow, agonizing physical math problem. They were chopping down the palm trees faster than the trees could naturally reproduce. Furthermore, the Polynesian settlers had accidentally brought rats with them in their canoes. The rats multiplied by the millions with no natural predators, and they ruthlessly ate the seeds of the palm trees, completely halting any new growth. Imagine the terrifying physical reality of the day the very last palm tree on the island was chopped down. When the last tree fell, the moai building industry instantly froze. The massive statues that were in transit were simply dropped in the dirt, abandoned on the hillsides where they remain to this day. But the tragedy of the last tree was not just about the statues. It was a total, cascading environmental collapse. Without the thick canopy of the palm forest, the heavy tropical rains began to violently pound the exposed earth. Without the deep, complex root systems of the trees to hold the dirt in place, the incredibly rich, vital topsoil simply washed away, bleeding into the salty ocean. The sweet potato crops began to systematically fail in the barren, rocky clay. Without the trees, the native birds that the islanders relied on for meat lost their nesting grounds and went entirely extinct. But the most horrific, claustrophobic realization was at the shoreline. The people of Rapa Nui relied heavily on deep-sea fishing to survive. They caught dolphins and large tuna. But to fish in the deep ocean, you need a sturdy, ocean-going canoe. To build a canoe, you need large, heavy timber. With the forests completely gone, they could no longer build boats. They could not repair their old ones. They were physically trapped on a rapidly degrading, starving rock, surrounded by millions of square miles of empty water, with absolutely no way to leave. The society violently imploded. The archaeological record shows a sudden, drastic shift. The elegant carving tools were replaced by thousands of mata, sharp, jagged obsidian spearheads. The clans turned on each other in a desperate, bloody scramble for the last remaining scraps of food. They moved out of their organized villages and hid in dark, damp lava caves to avoid being murdered in the night. In a final act of psychological despair and rage, the warring clans physically pushed over each other's massive moai statues, snapping their necks in the dirt. The gods they had destroyed their entire ecosystem to honor had completely failed to save them. When European ships finally discovered the island on Easter Sunday in 1722, they did not find a thriving Golden Age society of master builders. They found a desolate, wind-swept, treeless wasteland. They found a few thousand starving, traumatized survivors living in the shadows of the massive, toppled stone giants. The tragedy of Easter Island is the ultimate localized microcosm of the human experience. It is the purest distillation of the formula for doom. If you extract resources faster than the physical environment can replenish them, If you prioritize the construction of monuments, prestige, and endless growth over the basic, boring stability of your ecosystem, physics will eventually intervene. The soil will erode, the water will dry up, the trees will vanish, and the civilization, no matter how brilliantly engineered or deeply devoted to its gods, will collapse into the dust. As we pull back the lens from this tiny, tragic island in the Pacific and look at the globe as a whole today, we must ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. Are we so fundamentally different from the people of Rapa Nui? We will answer that question and finally reveal the shocking, final count of how many worlds have lived and died before us in our final chapter. We have walked the blistering, mud-baked streets of ancient Sumer and tasted their thick, cloudy beer. We have descended into the clean, perfectly geometric brick sewers of the Indus Valley. We have stared up at the massive, impossible stone animals carved by hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe, and we have watched the agonizing, slow-motion collapse of Easter Island as the very last palm tree hit the forest floor. We have peeled back the canopy of the Amazon with lasers to reveal vanished wooden metropolises, and we have waded through the murky waters of myth to find the terrifying physical truth behind the sinking of ancient worlds. After all of this, after digging through thousands of years of dirt, ash, and rusted bronze, we must finally answer the question we asked at the very beginning of this journey. Exactly how many civilizations has Earth had? When you open a standard high school history textbook, you are usually presented with a very neat, very sanitized number. They talk about the big 6 primary civilizations, the original cradles where humanity independently invented urban life. They point to Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes Mountains of South America. If you just look at that heavily edited list, you might think the number is incredibly small. You might think the rise of a civilization is an incredibly rare, freak accident of nature. But as we have seen, the dirt tells a completely different, overwhelmingly chaotic story. Humanity is relentlessly, furiously creative. We do not just build in the perfect river valleys. We build in the suffocating heat of the deep jungle. We build on the freezing, oxygen-deprived peaks of the Andes Mountains. And we build in the dry, unforgiving scrublands of southern Africa. When you step away from the big 6 and actually start counting every distinct, highly organized society that mastered agriculture, built sprawling urban centers, and created a complex system of trade and record-keeping, the numbers begin to multiply rapidly. You have to count the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Etruscans, and the Romans. You must tally the Olmec, the Toltec, the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Inca. You have to include the mighty Khmer Empire of Cambodia, building the massive stone temples of Angkor Wat. You have to count the Mississippians of North America building their earthen pyramids, the Kushites firing their iron furnaces in Sudan, and the Shona people stacking their mortarless granite walls at Great Zimbabwe. And those are just the empires we have actually found. Those are just the ones that left behind stone or earth heavy enough to survive the grinding wheels of time. If we include the massive, interconnected wooden civilizations of the Amazon basin that were violently erased by microscopic old-world diseases, if we count the potential maritime empires that were violently swallowed by the 400-foot rise in global sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The final shocking count of human civilizations is not 6, it is not 20. We are looking at a conservative estimate of several hundred highly distinct, fully realized civilizations that have risen, thrived, and ultimately collapsed into the dust over the last 12,000 years. And if we include the smaller, highly organized city-building cultures whose names have been completely wiped from the historical record, that number easily swells into the thousands. And if the haunting Silurian hypothesis holds even a fraction of truth, if an intelligent, non-human species built an industrial world tens of millions of years ago, then the number of empires this planet has hosted might be truly infinite, completely pulverized and melted down by the slow, churning tectonic recycling engine of the Earth. We are not the first. We are simply the latest tenants living on top of a massive global graveyard. This realization should completely shatter our modern arrogance. Today, we look at our towering skyscrapers of glass and steel. We look at our airplanes cutting through the clouds. And we look at the glowing digital screens in our hands. And we feel utterly invincible. We believe that we have somehow broken the ancient cycle. We believe that because we have split the atom and mapped the human genome, the harsh physical formulas of doom no longer apply to us. But look closely at the modern world. We are not fundamentally different from the people of ancient Rome, the Maya, or the desperate clans of Rapa Nui. We are still biological creatures, bound by the exact same physical laws. We still absolutely rely on 6 inches of fertile topsoil and the predictable cycle of rain to feed our billions. And we are currently facing the exact same terrifying environmental pressures that brought down the great empires of the past. We are depleting our ancient, underground water aquifers. We are watching our climate shift rapidly and violently. We are engaged in a frantic global race to extract the absolute maximum amount of resources from the Earth to fuel an engine of endless, infinite economic growth. But there is one massive, terrifying difference between us and the ghosts of the past. In the ancient world, if the Indus Valley civilization collapsed because their river dried up, the ancient Egyptians didn't even know it happened. They kept building their pyramids. If the Maya abandoned their jungle cities, the people of Great Zimbabwe kept trading their gold. The world was compartmentalized. The failures were localized. Today, we have built a single, massively interconnected global civilization. Our supply chains, our financial markets, and our agricultural networks are inextricably woven together. The Earth is no longer a vast, disconnected map. The Earth is now exactly like Easter Island. It is a single, closed system, floating alone in the terrifying, freezing, empty ocean of deep space. If we chop down our metaphorical last palm tree, if we exhaust the vital resources of this singular island, there is no neighboring planet coming to bring us rescue ships. If one massive pillar of our global system fractures, the shockwave will violently hit every single shore on this planet simultaneously. The dirt beneath our feet is packed with the ashes of thousands of empires that thought they would last forever. They were just as smart, just as ambitious, and just as deeply in love with their children as we are. We are standing on the shoulders of these ghosts. We should look at their ruined, silent cities not with a sense of superiority, but with profound humility, and a deep, urgent realization of how incredibly fragile our current moment in the sun truly is. Thank you for joining me on this massive journey through the forgotten layers of our world. If digging through the mysteries of the past resonated with you, and if you want to keep exploring the darkest, most fascinating corners of human history, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling me which lost civilization fascinated you the most, and if you are ready for your next adventure, click the video on your screen right now. I will see you there.